You cannot prove the external world exists. Not really. Not with the kind of certainty you assume you possess when you reach for a coffee cup or step onto a pavement. You believe fire causes heat, that the sun will rise tomorrow, that you are the same person who fell asleep last night. Yet none of these beliefs can be demonstrated through reason. Causation might be nothing more than habit, a trick your mind plays after witnessing events occurring together repeatedly. The self you think persists through time might be a convenient fiction, a story you tell about a succession of fleeting mental states that have no real unity. Your most basic convictions about reality, knowledge, and even your own existence rest on foundations that crumble the moment you examine them carefully. Yet you live. You live confidently, making plans, forming relationships, pursuing goals, trusting that the floor will support your weight and that other people possess minds like your own. This gap between what you can prove and how you actually live represents the fundamental human condition, not a philosophical puzzle to be solved abstractly, but the daily reality of every thinking person who has ever paused to wonder whether their certainties might be illusions. One philosopher mapped this territory more systematically than anyone before or since. David Hume proved, with devastating precision, that reason fails where we assume it succeeds. He demonstrated that our beliefs about causation cannot be rationally justified, that personal identity dissolves under scrutiny, that moral truth stems from sentiment rather than rational demonstration, that the external world's existence cannot be proven. He dismantled, piece by piece, every rational foundation we think supports our knowledge of reality. Then he explained how we live successfully anyway, not through reason, but through custom, natural belief, and psychological mechanisms that operate whether we understand them or not. The paradox became personal for Hume in ways that illuminate his philosophy's power. At 23, sitting in a French café in 1734, he experienced what he called a total alteration in my disposition, a breakdown whilst trying to become a lawyer that left his mind, in his own words, worn out with study and pained with anxiety. He abandoned law entirely, moved to rural France, and began writing a treatise of human nature, convinced it would revolutionize human understanding. The book appeared to sink without trace. Hume later called it dead-born from the press, utterly ignored by the world he thought he would transform. Yet this same man, whose philosophy seemed to undermine every certainty, lived as one of the most successful, sociable, and genuinely cheerful people of his era. His friends called him Le Bon David, Good David, for his remarkable warmth and humor. He enjoyed dinner parties, played backgammon, conversed brilliantly, formed deep friendships, and approached life with evident satisfaction. The philosopher who proved that reason cannot justify our basic beliefs lived more joyfully than most people who never questioned those beliefs at all. This wasn't contradiction. It was insight. Hume discovered that our cognitive limitations are not obstacles to human flourishing but the very mechanisms that make it possible. We live successfully, not despite reason's failures, but through psychological capacities that operate independently of rational justification. His experimental method, applying careful observation to mental phenomena themselves, revealed that custom shapes our causal expectations, that natural belief compels conviction about external objects, that moral sentiment provides motivation where rational demonstration cannot. These insights would anticipate modern psychology whilst remaining philosophically revolutionary, showing us that the gap between proof and practice isn't a problem to be solved, but human nature itself, finally understood clearly. The architecture of this understanding begins with a single insight about how ideas form in the mind, an insight so apparently simple it seems mundane, so philosophically powerful it becomes devastating when applied to our most cherished beliefs about knowledge, reality, and ourselves. Part 1. The Architecture of Mind. All our simple ideas in their first appearance are derived from simple impressions, which are correspondent to them, and which they exactly represent. This principle, stated in Hume's treatise of human nature, appeared almost mundane. It would become the most devastating critical weapon in the history of philosophy. What Hume identified was the fundamental architecture of mental life itself, the discovery that every thought, concept, and notion in the human mind traces back to the immediate data of experience. Impressions arrive as the raw material of consciousness, the warmth of sunlight, the sting of rejection, the taste of wine, the sight of crimson. These vivid, forceful experiences constitute our direct contact with reality. Ideas, by contrast, are copies, fainter reproductions that the mind can summon, combine, and manipulate even when the original impressions have faded. The idea of yesterday's sunset lacks the brilliance of witnessing it, yet derives all its content from that original visual impression. This distinction revolutionized philosophy by providing Hume with what he called a method for tracing ideas to their origins. When philosophers deployed grand terms like substance, necessary, connection, or infinite perfection, Hume posed a simple but devastating question. What impression gave rise to this idea? If no clear impression could be identified, the supposed idea revealed itself as meaningless confusion, what Hume dismissed as sophistry and illusion, deserving to be committed to the flames. The copy principle doesn't deny the mind's creative powers. We easily form ideas of golden mountains or virtuous horses, complex notions we've never directly experienced. Yet these combinations remain meaningful precisely because we can trace their components, gold, mountain, virtue, horse, to specific impressions. The mind operates like a master craftsman, creating new structures from familiar materials, but never generating materials from nothing. This principle established both the mind's dependence on experience and its remarkable capacity for innovation within those constraints. Every flight of imagination, every abstract theory, every religious vision must ultimately decompose into elements drawn from the sensory and emotional impressions that constitute human experience. The copy principle thus becomes simultaneously descriptive and critical, explaining how the mind actually works, whilst providing a test for distinguishing meaningful ideas from empty pretensions. The true power of this principle emerges when Hume applies it to philosophy's most cherished concepts: causation, personal identity, external objects, divine perfection. All these fundamental notions must submit to the same rigorous examination. If they cannot be traced to clear impressions, our confidence in them may prove entirely misplaced. The copy principle promises to separate genuine knowledge from centuries of accumulated philosophical confusion. David Hume presents us with one of philosophy's most elegant puzzles. Imagine someone who has experienced every shade of blue except one, a particular intermediate tone. These blues are arranged before them in a perfect spectrum, from the deepest navy to the palest sky, with a single gap where that missing shade should appear. Could this person, Hume asks, form an idea of that absent blue without ever having seen it? His answer is striking. Yes, they probably could, through reasoning about the relationships between the blues they have experienced. They might well conceive of the precise shade that belongs in that empty space. This admission creates a profound problem. The missing shade of blue appears to violate Hume's copy principle, the foundational claim that all our ideas derive from corresponding impressions. Here we have what seems to be a genuinely new, simple idea, created not through experience, but through the mind's capacity to reason about relationships and fill conceptual gaps. The person generates an idea of blue they have never encountered, suggesting our mental powers might operate more independently of sensory experience than Hume's system allows. The philosophical significance extends far beyond this single color. If the mind can produce even one simple idea without a matching impression, the entire empiricist edifice becomes questionable. This exception could vindicate defenders of innate ideas or rational intuition. Those who argue that reason alone can deliver genuine knowledge about reality. The missing shade threatens to crack open a door that Hume has worked systematically to close, admitting sources of knowledge that transcend the boundaries of experience. Yet Hume's response reveals his intellectual integrity. Rather than abandoning his principle or explaining away this troublesome case, he acknowledges it directly, whilst maintaining that it is so singular that it is scarcely worth our observing, and does not merit that for it alone we should alter our general maxim. This honest admission actually strengthens his position. He demonstrates that he is not dogmatically defending a theory, but genuinely investigating how human understanding operates. The very fact that we can identify this case as exceptional confirms the copy principle's overwhelming validity in ordinary mental life. What emerges is something more sophisticated than rigid adherence to abstract rules. Hume shows us a philosopher willing to acknowledge complications and exceptions rather than forcing reality into theoretical straitjackets. This flexibility becomes characteristic of his entire approach. He seeks to understand how the mind actually functions rather than how it ought to function according to philosophical ideals. The missing shade reveals that our mental operations, whilst generally constrained by experience, possess subtle capacities for extrapolation and relationship mapping that follow their own discoverable patterns. David Hume's revolutionary insight begins with a deceptively simple observation. Every idea in your mind can be traced back to an impression you've actually experienced. When you think of the taste of a pineapple, that idea corresponds exactly to the sweet, tangy sensation you once felt on your tongue. The warmth of sunlight on your skin, the sharp sound of breaking glass, the particular shade of blue in a summer sky. These are what Hume calls simple ideas, and they cannot be broken down into component parts. They arrive in consciousness as perfect copies of simple impressions, carrying the full force of their original sensory encounter. But the mind possesses a remarkable creative power that extends far beyond passive reception. Complex ideas emerge when we compound, transpose, augment, or diminish the materials afforded us by the senses and experience. Consider the Golden Mountain. You've never seen such a thing, yet the idea forms effortlessly by combining your impression of gold with your impression of a mountain. New Jerusalem, with its streets of precious stones and gates of pearl, springs from the mind's ability to recombine familiar elements into novel configurations. The imagination, as Hume observes, is nothing if not free within the constraints of experienced materials. This freedom operates through three fundamental mental operations. Combination allows us to join separate ideas. The body of a horse with the horn of a unicorn creates a creature that has never galloped across any earthly field. Separation enables us to consider the deep red of a rose apart from its velvet texture or sweet fragrance, isolating qualities that in experience always appear together. Variation lets us imagine familiar objects as vastly larger or smaller, more or less perfect than anything we've encountered. A palace that dwarfs Versailles, a circle more perfect than any compass could draw. These operations explain our capacity to think about things we've never experienced without requiring mysterious, non-empirical sources of knowledge. When children imagine dragons breathing fire, or adults contemplate perfect justice, they're not accessing some platonic realm of eternal forms. They're exercising the mind's natural power to manipulate the raw materials of sensation and reflection. The dragon emerges from combining reptilian features with the experience of fire, perfect justice from varying and extending our limited encounters with fairness and impartiality. Even our most abstract thinking remains anchored to this empirical foundation. When mathematicians reason about triangles in general, they're not contemplating a perfect triangular essence existing beyond the physical world. They're manipulating ideas derived from particular triangular impressions: the corner of a table, the shape of a sail, the peak of a mountain, whilst using the mind's power to separate the triangular form from its material context. The concept of a perfect circle arises from varying our imperfect circular impressions, extending them toward an ideal limit that experience suggests but never quite reaches. This analysis provides Hume with a powerful method for examining disputed philosophical concepts. If causation, substance, or personal identity are complex ideas, we should be able to identify their simple components and trace these back to specific impressions. If they're supposed to be simple ideas, we should be able to point to the impressions from which they're copied. Any concept that fails both tests reveals itself as confused, meaningless, or perhaps something altogether different from what traditional philosophy assumed. The stage is set for a systematic examination of our most fundamental beliefs about reality, knowledge, and ourselves. David Hume made what he considered his greatest discovery whilst examining the workings of the human mind. He found, as he put it, a kind of attraction, which in the mental world will be found to have as extraordinary effects as in the natural, and to show itself in as many and as various forms. Just as Newton had revealed the invisible force of gravity that governs the motion of planets and falling apples, Hume believed he had uncovered the psychological equivalent, the hidden forces that govern the motion of ideas within consciousness. These forces operate through three fundamental principles of association. First, resemblance draws similar ideas together naturally. When we encounter something, our mind spontaneously calls up ideas of things that look, sound, or feel similar. Second, contiguity in time and place connects ideas of things we have experienced together. Events that occurred simultaneously or in the same location become mentally linked, so that recalling one tends to evoke the other. Third, cause and effect creates associations between ideas we believe to be causally connected. The idea of a cause naturally suggests its effect, and vice versa. These principles work automatically, without conscious direction. They create what Hume calls a gentle force, which commonly prevails over the random wandering of thought. When you see a portrait hanging on a wall, resemblance immediately leads your mind to the person it depicts. When someone mentions Rome, contiguity makes you think of other Italian cities you associate with it. When you notice smoke rising from a chimney, causation makes you expect fire below. You don't choose these mental transitions. They happen spontaneously, powered by associations built through past experience. The strength of these associations varies considerably. Vivid, recent impressions create stronger connections than faint or distant ones. Frequently repeated experiences forge more powerful links than isolated encounters. A song heard repeatedly during a significant period of your life will trigger more intense associations than one heard only once. The smell of bread baking might instantly transport you to your grandmother's kitchen if that connection was established through many childhood visits. Through association, Hume explains complex mental phenomena that had previously seemed mysterious. Memory operates through contiguity associations that connect present ideas with past impressions in temporal sequence. When you remember yesterday's conversation, associative links guide your mind back through the chain of connected experiences. Imagination works differently, freely combining ideas through resemblance to create new combinations that may never have existed in reality. A painter imagining a golden mountain draws on associations between the idea of gold and the idea of mountains, even though no such mountain exists. Most crucially, belief itself arises from the operation of association. When associative connections are strong enough, they don't merely suggest related ideas. They make those ideas feel vivid and present rather than merely conceived. The difference between believing fire exists behind the smoke and merely imagining it lies not in rational calculation, but in the strength of the associative connection built through past experience of smoke and fire together. This reveals association as the foundation of Hume's revolutionary approach to human psychology. Rather than viewing the mind as a rational faculty that chooses its thoughts according to logical principles, he presents it as a natural mechanism governed by discoverable laws. Part 2. The problem of causation. When Hume examined the collision of billiard balls, he made an observation that would shake the foundations of human knowledge. As one ball strikes another, what exactly do we witness? We observe spatial contiguity, the first ball moving toward the second. We observe temporal succession, the collision occurring at a precise moment. We observe constant conjunction, the second ball beginning to move immediately afterward. But do we observe the power, force, or necessary connection that supposedly compels the second ball to move? Hume's careful analysis reveals something startling. We see only the sequence of events, never the causal power that makes one event necessitate another. This pattern extends across every causal relationship we encounter. When fire produces heat, we observe spatial and temporal relationships plus constant conjunction, but never witness the power by which fire necessitates warmth. When medicine promotes recovery from illness, we observe temporal succession and hopefully constant conjunction, but never glimpse the mechanism by which the remedy compels healing. Whether we examine the growth of plants towards sunlight, the fall of objects toward earth, or the expansion of metals under heat, the same limitation emerges. We observe regularities, but never necessities. Consider what this means for our fundamental concept of causation. If causation essentially involves necessary connection, the idea that causes must produce their effects, and we never observe necessary connection, then our causal concept appears to outrun our experience entirely. Hume captured this profound insight. All events seem entirely loose and separate. One event follows another, but we never can observe any tie between them. They seem conjoined, but never connected. This observation launches a challenge to our most basic way of understanding the world. Yet we confidently expect causal regularities to continue. We expect fire to produce heat, medicine to promote healing, billiard balls to behave predictably. But if observation shows us only past conjunctions, never necessary connections, what justifies our confidence about future cases? If experience reveals mere succession rather than compulsion, how do we bridge the gap between observed regularity and expected necessity? Hume's investigation into whether reason can justify this leap would reveal something even more unsettling about the foundations of human knowledge. Hume delivers a devastating blow to rational philosophy through a simple yet profound observation. We can conceive of any cause occurring without its usual effect. Strike a match, and we can perfectly well imagine it failing to light. drop a stone, and we can conceive of it floating upward rather than falling. Place bread in our mouth, and we can imagine it providing no nourishment whatsoever. These scenarios involve no logical contradiction. Unlike attempting to conceive of a four-sided triangle or a married bachelor, since whatever we can conceive is possible, and whatever is possible cannot be necessarily false, causal connections cannot involve logical necessity. This conceivability test exposes the contingent nature of all causal relationships. When we witness fire following the striking of a match, we observe a regular succession, not a necessary connection. The effect does not follow from the cause with the same inevitability that the conclusion of a valid syllogism follows from its premises. Reason can demonstrate that all bachelors are unmarried because this follows from definitions, but it cannot demonstrate that matches must light when struck because no logical principle compels this connection. The implications prove devastating for our understanding of rational knowledge. Reason excels at demonstrating relationships that hold necessarily mathematical truths, logical principles, definitional connections. These constitute what Hume calls relations of ideas, truths that depend solely on the meanings of our concepts and can be established through pure thought. But causal relationships belong to matters of fact, contingent states of affairs that could be otherwise without logical contradiction. This classification places causal knowledge in a category that reason alone cannot establish, undermining centuries of philosophical confidence in rational demonstration of natural laws. Philosophers attempt to rescue rational causation through a priori principles, like the principle of sufficient reason, arguing that every event must have a cause as a truth of reason itself. Some claim that similar causes must produce similar effects by logical necessity, or that the uniformity of nature follows from rational principles. But Hume exposes the circular reasoning underlying these attempts. The principle that every event has a cause cannot be proven without assuming causal reasoning is valid, which is precisely what stands in question. To establish that similar causes must produce similar effects, we would need to assume the very causal regularity we seek to demonstrate. This creates a profound philosophical crisis. If reason cannot establish that causes must produce their effects, what justifies our expectation that future cases will resemble past ones? We have observed constant conjunction in the past. Bread has nourished, fire has burned, stones have fallen, but reason cannot prove this pattern will continue. The statement, "the future will not resemble the past," involves no logical contradiction whatsoever. We can conceive of a world where natural laws suddenly cease operating, where familiar objects behave in entirely unprecedented ways. Yet whilst this reasoning threatens to undermine all factual knowledge, we find ourselves psychologically incapable of doubting our causal expectations, creating a tension between philosophical reflection and natural belief that demands resolution. Although reason fails to justify our causal beliefs, we continue forming them automatically through custom and habit. When we repeatedly experience constant conjunction between events, our minds develop associative connections that make us expect similar conjunctions in future cases. This expectation is not rational inference but natural belief, a psychological disposition that arises inevitably from our mental constitution. Hume declares that custom is the great guide of human life because it provides practical certainty that reason cannot deliver. The psychological mechanism behind causal belief formation operates through the principle of association. Repeated experience of constant conjunction strengthens connections between ideas in our minds. When we encounter what we take to be a cause, association automatically calls up the idea of its usual effect with such vividness that we believe in the effect's occurrence. This belief feels different from mere conception. It has what Hume calls superior force and vivacity that compels assent. The process operates below the level of conscious reasoning, arising from the fundamental structure of human imagination. Consider how this mechanism actually works. When you see flame approach paper, you immediately expect burning, not because you've reasoned through causal principles, but because repeated experience has created an automatic association. The idea of fire calls up the idea of burning with such force that you believe it will occur. This belief emerges from habit, not from logical deduction about necessary connections. This naturalistic solution actually works better than rational justification would. Custom and habit are reliable guides because they're based on extensive experience and operate through the same associative principles that govern all mental life. They automatically adjust to changing circumstances. If constant conjunctions break down, our expectations gradually adjust accordingly. Unlike rigid rational principles, natural belief is flexible and self-correcting through continued experience. The apparent tension between philosophical skepticism and natural belief dissolves under examination. Hume shows we can acknowledge that causal necessity cannot be rationally proven whilst continuing to live confidently through natural belief. Philosophy reveals the limits of reason, but nature ensures we don't become paralyzed by these limits. This creates a sophisticated position. Intellectual humility about rational justification combined with practical confidence based on psychological necessity. This pattern, skeptical challenge resolved through naturalistic explanation, will prove central to Hume's entire philosophical project, extending far beyond causation to encompass our most fundamental beliefs about reality. Part 3. The problem of induction. Every time we expect bread to nourish us tomorrow, fire to burn our fingers next week, or stones to fall when dropped next month, we're making a profound logical leap that Hume recognized as fundamentally unjustifiable. This leap forms the heart of what philosophers call the problem of induction, and it reveals a startling gap between the rational foundations we believe support our knowledge and the psychological habits that actually govern our thinking. The problem emerges from a simple observation about how we form beliefs about unobserved matters of fact. When we predict that the sun will rise tomorrow, we're extrapolating from countless past experiences of sunrise to a future expectation. When we trust that gravity will continue operating, we're extending observed regularities into unobserved cases. But this extension requires assuming that nature operates uniformly across time and space, that unobserved instances will resemble observed ones, that the future will fundamentally resemble the past. This assumption seems so natural, so obviously true, that questioning it appears almost perverse. Yet Hume demonstrated that this assumption cannot be rationally justified without falling into circular reasoning. Any attempt to prove that nature operates uniformly must appeal to past experience of uniformity. We might argue that natural laws have remained constant throughout recorded history, so they'll likely continue unchanged. But this argument itself assumes that past patterns of uniformity predict future patterns of uniformity. Precisely the principle we're trying to establish. The circularity runs deeper than it initially appears. We cannot demonstrate, as Hume put it, the necessity of a cause to produce an effect, because such demonstration would require assuming the very causal necessity we seek to prove. Every piece of evidence for uniformity comes from past experience, and using past experience to justify future expectations presupposes that past experience provides reliable guidance for future events. We're trapped in what logicians call a petitio principii. Hume's insight becomes even more unsettling when we recognize that skepticism about induction involves no logical contradiction. We can perfectly well conceive of a world where natural laws suddenly change, where fire begins freezing objects instead of burning them, where bread becomes poisonous instead of nourishing, where gravity reverses direction without warning. These scenarios may seem practically absurd, wildly implausible given our experience. Since logical possibility is all that's required for rational doubt, inductive reasoning lacks the certainty that characterizes genuine rational knowledge. The scope of this problem extends far beyond scientific prediction into virtually every domain of human knowledge. Historical reasoning assumes that past testimony and evidence correspond to actual past events. Expectations about human behavior rest on patterns observed in previous interactions. Even memory itself depends on the inductive assumption that past impressions correspond to past realities. The problem of induction thus threatens to undermine not merely scientific method, but the entire edifice of empirical knowledge. Yet, here lies the peculiar tension that fascinated Hume. Whilst we cannot rationally justify inductive reasoning, we remain psychologically compelled to continue making inductive inferences. We cannot help but expect bread to nourish, fire to burn, stones to fall. This compulsion operates independently of rational justification, suggesting that human nature itself bridges the logical gap that reason cannot cross. The most curious feature of inductive skepticism is its complete practical impotence. Even the philosopher who has just finished demonstrating that no inductive inference can be rationally justified will unhesitatingly expect his morning coffee to caffeinate him and his keys to unlock his door. Hume observed this psychological puzzle with characteristic precision. The same mind that acknowledges the logical gap between past regularities and future expectations continues to bridge that gap automatically, thousands of times each day. We find ourselves caught between philosophical sophistication and natural necessity. This tension reveals something profound about human psychology that traditional philosophy had overlooked. The sophisticated skeptic who doubts inductive reasoning whilst expecting bread to nourish and fire to burn is not being inconsistent. He is demonstrating that inductive inference operates through entirely different psychological mechanisms than rational argument. When we see dark clouds and expect rain, we are not actually reasoning from premises to conclusions. We are experiencing an immediate, automatic transition from one idea to another, a psychological movement that feels like inference because it is systematic and reliable, but which actually operates through the same associative processes that govern memory, imagination, and habit. Hume's revolutionary insight was that this automatic transition is not a defective form of reasoning, but a different kind of psychological process altogether. The mind, shaped by countless repetitions of experienced conjunctions, develops what he called custom or habit, a tendency to move naturally from familiar causes to expected effects. This movement requires no rational justification because it is not rational in its fundamental operation. It is biological, evolved, natural. When flame has been constantly conjoined with heat in our experience, the mind develops an irresistible propensity to expect heat when flame appears. This expectation emerges from our psychological constitution, not from logical demonstration. This naturalistic explanation dissolves the apparent paradox entirely. We do not become paralyzed by inductive skepticism because inductive belief does not depend on rational justification in the first place. Nature has equipped us with belief-forming mechanisms that generate reliable expectations about environmental regularities, whether or not we can prove they should work. These mechanisms operate through sentiment and feeling rather than reason and argument. The mind naturally moves from experienced regularities to confident expectations, and this movement is so fundamental to human psychology that philosophical doubt cannot dislodge it. What emerges is a sophisticated philosophical position that acknowledges rational limitations whilst embracing psychological necessity. We can recognize that our most basic beliefs about the world, that objects will continue to behave as they have, that natural regularities will persist, that the future will resemble the past, cannot be rationally demonstrated. But we can also recognize that rational demonstration is not required for successful living or even for successful science. Our natural belief-forming mechanisms, refined by evolution and experience, provide a more reliable foundation for navigating reality than any philosophical argument could supply. This creates what might be called intellectual humility without practical paralysis. The Humean position acknowledges the limits of human reason while celebrating the adequacy of human nature. Hume's response to the problem of induction reveals something remarkable. The most profound, skeptical challenge in philosophy leads not to paralysis, but to a more sophisticated understanding of human nature itself. Having demonstrated that inductive reasoning lacks rational justification, Hume doesn't retreat into dogmatic denial or surrender to complete doubt. Instead, he recommends what he calls moderate skepticism, a position that acknowledges reason's limitations whilst embracing the natural human responses that actually guide our lives. This moderate skepticism embodies a crucial insight about philosophical doubt itself. As Hume observes, a true skeptic will be diffident of his philosophical doubts, as well as of his philosophical conviction. The genuine skeptic recognizes that skeptical arguments, however compelling in the study, cannot be sustained with absolute consistency. We must be skeptical even about our skepticism, understanding that philosophical doubt has its own limitations and proper sphere of application. Why does extreme skepticism prove both impossible and useless? Hume notes that even the most committed philosophical skeptic cannot maintain their doubt outside the realm of abstract reasoning. Nature is always too strong for principle, he declares. When we leave our philosophical reflections and engage with the world, eating breakfast, crossing streets, making plans, natural belief reasserts itself automatically. The skeptic who genuinely refused to make inductive inferences could not function for a single day. They could not eat, trusting that bread will nourish rather than poison, could not travel, expecting roads to support their weight, could not plan, anticipating that the future will resemble the past in basic ways. This practical impossibility reveals something profound about extreme skepticism. It provides no guidance for action and would make human life impossible if consistently maintained. The philosophical skeptic who argues that we have no reason to believe the sun will rise tomorrow nevertheless sets their alarm clock and plans their morning activities. This isn't hypocrisy. It demonstrates that human beings operate according to psychological principles that function independently of rational justification. Moderate skepticism, by contrast, offers genuine philosophical and practical benefits. Intellectually, recognizing the limits of rational demonstration promotes humility about our beliefs and prevents dogmatic overconfidence. When we understand that even our most basic assumptions about causation and induction lack ultimate rational foundation, we become more tolerant of disagreement and more willing to revise our beliefs based on new experience. We can hold our convictions firmly enough to act upon them whilst remaining open to correction. Practically, this moderate position helps us navigate uncertainty more effectively. Understanding that our beliefs arise from natural psychological mechanisms rather than rational proof allows us to trust our instincts whilst maintaining appropriate flexibility. We can rely on our natural tendency to expect regularities in nature without demanding absolute certainty before we act. This creates a more nuanced relationship with knowledge, confident enough for practical purposes, humble enough for continued inquiry. Hume's treatment of induction thus reveals a positive vision of human nature. We are naturally equipped to navigate an uncertain world through psychological mechanisms that prove reliable without being rationally justifiable. Our minds spontaneously form expectations based on past experience, and these expectations, whilst lacking logical foundation, enable successful action and survival. Part 4. Personal identity. When Hume turns his empirical method toward the most intimate question of all, the nature of personal identity, he performs an experiment that shakes the very foundations of selfhood. We naturally believe ourselves to be unified, continuing persons who remain the same individual despite constant changes in our thoughts, feelings, and physical characteristics. This belief feels so fundamental that questioning it seems almost absurd. Yet Hume asks the crucial empirical question: what impression gives rise to our idea of the self? This question demands introspection of the most rigorous kind. If the self exists as we suppose it does, as a simple, continuing substance that underlies all our experiences, then we should be able to observe it directly. We should find an impression of this self, just as we find impressions of color. But when Hume searches within his own consciousness for this supposed self, his findings prove startling. For my part, when one enter most intimately into what one call myself, one always stumble on some particular perception or other, of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. One never can catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception. This careful phenomenological analysis reveals something remarkable. The self, if it exists, proves remarkably elusive when we attempt to observe it directly. Every time Hume looks for himself, he finds only specific mental contents, particular thoughts, emotions, sensations, memories, but never the self that supposedly has these experiences. The implications of this failure prove profound. According to the copy principle that grounds Hume's empiricism, if we cannot trace an idea to its originating impression, we should regard it with suspicion. The idea of a simple, continuing self appears to be either meaningless or confused, a philosophical fiction rather than an empirical reality. This challenges not merely abstract philosophical theories, but our most basic sense of being unified, persistent individuals. What then do we actually find when we examine experience without presuppositions? Hume offers a radically different description. We discover nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions, which succeed each other with an inconceivable rapidity and are in a perpetual flux and movement. The mind resembles a theatre where various perceptions make their appearance, pass, repass, glide away, and mingle in an infinite variety of postures and situations. Yet Hume adds a crucial qualification that makes his position even more radical. The comparison of the theatre must not mislead us. They are the successive perceptions only that constitute the mind, nor have we the most distant notion of the place where these scenes are represented, or of the materials of which it is composed. There is no theatre, no stage on which perceptions appear, no underlying substance that has experiences. There are only the perceptions themselves, arising and passing away in ceaseless succession. This bundle theory creates profound puzzles about moral responsibility and personal continuity. If there is no continuing self, what makes me responsible for actions performed by this collection of perceptions yesterday? What ensures that the person who wakes tomorrow morning will be the same individual who falls asleep tonight? Hume's empirical honesty forces us to confront the possibility that our deepest assumptions about personal identity rest on philosophical illusion rather than experiential fact. David Hume's investigation into personal identity yields one of philosophy's most unsettling conclusions. The self you believe persists through time is an elaborate fiction. When Hume turns his empirical method inward, examining the contents of consciousness itself, he discovers not a unified, continuing self, but rather what he calls a bundle or collection of different perceptions, which succeed each other with an inconceivable rapidity and are in a perpetual flux and movement. This bundle theory emerges from Hume's rigorous application of his theory of ideas. Since all meaningful concepts must derive from impressions, Hume searches for the impression that gives rise to our idea of self. He finds none. Instead of encountering a simple, unchanging self, when he introspects, Hume discovers only particular perceptions, a feeling of warmth, a memory of yesterday's conversation, a hope for tomorrow's weather, an idea of justice. These perceptions arise and fade in constant succession, connected not by some underlying substantial self, but by psychological relationships of resemblance, contiguity, and causation. What we mistake for personal identity is actually the mind's natural tendency to impose unity upon this stream of related perceptions. Memory links present consciousness to past experiences, creating the impression that the person remembering is identical to the person who originally had those experiences. Imagination projects future possibilities, making us feel continuous with our anticipated selves. The association of ideas creates apparent connections between related mental states, weaving them into what seems like a coherent narrative of selfhood. Hume illuminates this psychological construction through his analogy with gradually changing objects. We consider a river the same river despite the constant flow of different water through its banks. We call an oak tree the same tree despite its growth from sapling to maturity, despite the seasonal loss and renewal of its leaves. The tree of today shares no material particles with the tree of 20 years ago, yet we treat them as identical because of their causal connection and gradual transformation. Similarly, the bundle of perceptions that constitutes your mind today bears only psychological resemblance and causal connection to the bundle that existed yesterday. The continuity is constructed by the mind's propensity to mistake these relationships for substantial identity. What feels like the persistence of self through time is actually the successive appearance of related but distinct bundles of perceptions, each momentarily existing before giving way to the next. This analysis generates profound implications that threaten the foundations of moral and social life. If there is no persistent self, what justifies holding people accountable for past actions? The person who committed a crime yesterday and the person standing trial today are, strictly speaking, different bundles of perceptions, connected only by memory and psychological resemblance. Why should this later bundle suffer punishment for actions performed by an earlier, numerically distinct collection of mental states? The challenge extends to all forms of moral responsibility. Praise and blame assume that the person receiving judgment is identical to the person who performed the praiseworthy or blameworthy action. But if personal identity is constructed rather than real, this assumption appears groundless. Similarly, the honoring of commitments and contracts depends on the fiction that the person making a promise is the same person later bound to fulfill it. The bundle theory also undermines beliefs about survival after death and the coherence of future-oriented motivation. The bundle theory presents a philosophical puzzle that extends far beyond academic speculation. If personal identity truly dissolves under careful analysis, why do we persist in thinking and acting as unified, continuing persons? Hume recognized this tension between philosophical conclusion and lived experience, acknowledging that his skeptical arguments about the self fail to eliminate our practical sense of personal identity. Memory creates the psychological foundation for this persistence. When you recall yesterday's experiences, they don't feel like observations of someone else's life. They feel unmistakably yours. This remembered continuity generates a sense of temporal unity that bridges the gaps between discrete perceptions. Your childhood memories, recent conversations, and present thoughts seem to belong to the same continuing consciousness, creating an apparent narrative thread that philosophy cannot entirely unravel. The bundle theory may be correct about the metaphysical status of personal identity, but memory ensures that we experience ourselves as more than mere collections of fleeting impressions. Social interaction reinforces this psychological continuity through external recognition and expectation. Others treat you as a continuing person with stable characteristics, holding you accountable for past actions and expecting you to honor previous commitments. Friends relate to your personality traits as enduring features rather than momentary phenomena. Society assigns you responsibilities based on your history and judges your character through accumulated actions over time. This social framework creates powerful pressure to maintain consistent self-concepts and fulfill identity-based obligations, making personal identity practically real, regardless of its philosophical problems. Hume himself experienced this tension acutely, admitting that philosophical reflection on personal identity felt artificial when contrasted with natural belief. After hours spent analyzing the bundle theory, he would return to ordinary life, where skeptical conclusions seemed cold and strained and ridiculous. He dined, played backgammon, conversed with friends, and found himself naturally thinking as a continuing person despite his philosophical arguments to the contrary. This honest acknowledgement reveals the limits of philosophical reasoning when confronted with ingrained psychological tendencies. His mature position embraces this paradox rather than resolving it. We should accept natural belief in continuing selfhood whilst remaining philosophically aware of its problematic foundations. Personal identity becomes a useful fiction that enables moral responsibility, social cooperation, and individual planning, even though it cannot be rationally justified. This pattern mirrors Hume's approach to causation and induction. Skeptical analysis reveals the limits of reason, but natural psychology provides practical solutions that allow us to navigate the world effectively. Part 5. External objects and the external world. We naturally believe in objects that exist independently of our perceptions: tables, chairs, trees, other people. Yet philosophical analysis reveals this belief's questionable foundations. All we directly experience are perceptions themselves, the colors we see, sounds we hear, textures we feel, tastes and smells we encounter. We never experience the external objects supposedly causing these perceptions, only the perceptions themselves. This creates a profound gap between what we actually experience, mental contents, and what we confidently believe in, independent objects existing beyond our minds. Any attempt to bridge this gap through inference faces the problem of causal reasoning that Hume has already undermined. We might argue that our perceptions must be caused by external objects, but this assumes causal reasoning possesses rational foundation. We've seen that causation itself lacks such foundation. It's merely constant conjunction, reinforced by habit. Moreover, even if causal reasoning were valid, we could never verify that our perceptions accurately represent their external causes. We can only compare perceptions with other perceptions, never with the objects themselves. The supposed resemblance between our ideas and external objects remains forever beyond verification. This creates a deeper philosophical trap. If experience only grants access to mental contents, how can we ever prove that anything exists beyond those contents? Is less than #0. 5 hash is greater than. The external world becomes philosophically problematic once we recognize that all evidence for its existence must come through the very perceptions whose relationship to external reality stands in question. We're trapped in a world of ideas with no reliable bridge to external reality. Hume formulates this challenge with devastating precision. By what argument can it be proved that the perceptions of the mind must be caused by external objects entirely different from them, though resembling them, if that be possible, and could not arise either from the energy of the mind itself or from the suggestion of some invisible and unknown spirit, or from some other cause still more unknown to us? This question exposes how both common sense and philosophical sophistication fail to solve the problem satisfactorily. Common sense simply assumes external objects exist, whilst philosophical reasoning cannot establish their existence without circular argument. The great skeptic has revealed another fundamental limitation of human reason. David Hume recognized that the problem of the external world reveals a fascinating split in human thinking. On one side stands what he called the vulgar system, the natural, unreflective way ordinary people navigate their relationship with the world around them. When a farmer sees the red of a ripe apple or feels the roughness of tree bark, he doesn't pause to consider whether his perception of redness or roughness corresponds to something in the apple or bark itself. He simply identifies his experience with the object. The redness he sees is the apple's redness. The roughness he feels is the bark's roughness. This direct identification of perceptions with external objects dissolves the external world problem before it can even arise. There is no gap between mind and world because perceptions simply are features of external things. This vulgar approach possesses an elegant simplicity that solves through assumption what philosophy struggles to prove. Yet Hume saw that this naive realism cannot survive careful examination. The same apple appears bright red in sunlight and deep crimson in shadow, yet we assume the apple's color remains constant. A church bell sounds crisp and clear when we stand beside it, muffled and distant from across the valley, though we believe the bell itself produces a single, unchanging sound. Our hands, chilled from winter air, make lukewarm water feel hot, whilst the same water feels merely tepid to hands warmed by a fire. These variations in perception, whilst objects supposedly remain unchanged, force us toward a more sophisticated understanding. This philosophical sophistication distinguishes between our perceptions, which clearly vary, and their external causes, which presumably remain constant. The apple possesses some inherent property that causes different color perceptions under different conditions. The bell has acoustic properties that produce varying auditory experiences, depending on our position. Water has a temperature that creates different thermal sensations, depending on our bodily state. This distinction seems intellectually superior to naive identification, more rigorous, more scientifically respectable, more philosophically mature. Yet Hume's genius lay in recognizing that this apparent sophistication creates a far more devastating problem than the naive realism it replaced. Once we separate perceptions from their external causes, we face the haunting question of how these mental contents relate to physical objects and whether we can ever know that such objects exist at all. The philosophical system that promised greater rigor has actually made the external world infinitely more problematic. We now inhabit a realm of perceptions with no direct access to the objects that supposedly cause them. The gap between mind and world, which the vulgar system avoided by denial, has become an unbridgeable chasm. Hume's crucial insight penetrates deeper than this critique of both systems. He recognized that their failure stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of how human beings actually relate to the external world. Both the vulgar and philosophical systems assume we can solve through theory what nature has already solved through instinct. The vulgar system works practically. People successfully navigate their environment, avoid dangers, pursue goals, but fails when subjected to theoretical scrutiny. The philosophical system achieves theoretical sophistication but proves practically useless for actual living. Our belief in external objects is neither a rational conclusion we reach through argument, nor a naive mistake we make through ignorance. It operates as a natural psychological necessity that functions independently of philosophical justification. Hume's naturalistic resolution to the problem of external objects reveals something profound about human psychology. Despite the philosophical difficulties in proving that objects exist independently of our perceptions, we cannot help believing they do. This belief emerges not from rational demonstration but from the irresistible operations of our mental constitution. When we encounter perceptions that display what Hume calls constancy and coherence, the imagination automatically attributes them to continuing external objects. Constancy occurs when objects appear unchanged upon our return to them. The book remains on the table. The mountain keeps its shape. Coherence appears when objects change in predictable, rule-governed ways. The fire burns down gradually. The fruit ripens according to natural patterns. This natural belief operates through the same associative principles that govern all mental life. Memory preserves impressions of past perceptions, creating a repository of familiar patterns. When present perceptions resemble these stored impressions, association generates the powerful sense that we're encountering the same objects again. The imagination performs its most crucial work by filling gaps in our experience. When we leave a room and return to find objects apparently unchanged, we naturally assume they continued existing during our absence, even though we possess no direct evidence for this assumption. The mind bridges these temporal gaps automatically, creating the seamless experience of a world that persists beyond our immediate perception. This natural solution proves superior to philosophical alternatives because practical life demands assuming external objects exist independently. We successfully navigate our environment, manipulate tools, predict how objects will behave, and coordinate with others based on shared assumptions about external reality. These practical successes suggest our natural beliefs function as reliable guides, even whilst remaining philosophically unjustifiable. We plan journeys assuming roads will remain where we left them, store food expecting it to spoil at predictable rates, and build structures trusting materials to maintain their properties over time. Hume's mature position embraces this natural belief, whilst maintaining intellectual awareness of its rational limitations. We should accept our psychological conviction that external objects exist independently, recognizing this conviction as both irresistible and practically successful, even though it cannot be rationally demonstrated. This exemplifies moderate skepticism, acknowledging that our most basic beliefs transcend rational proof, whilst embracing them as psychologically necessary and empirically fruitful. The external world becomes a natural belief that enables successful action rather than a philosophical conclusion requiring demonstration. This naturalistic approach, treating belief as a psychological phenomenon rather than a rational judgment, extends beyond physical objects to encompass religious convictions and extraordinary claims about reality's ultimate nature. Part 6. Miracles and the Critique of Supernatural Belief. Hume defines a miracle with surgical precision, a violation of the laws of nature brought about by divine intervention. This definition proves more devastating than it first appears. Natural laws represent the most regular and universal patterns in human experience. Fire burns, water flows downhill, dead bodies decay, heavy objects fall toward earth. These regularities emerge from countless observations across different times, places, and cultures. They form the bedrock of human understanding about how the world operates. When someone claims a miracle has occurred, they assert that these universal regularities have been suspended in a particular case through supernatural agency. The dead have risen. Water has turned to wine. The blind have received sight through divine touch. But here lies the evidential trap Hume springs. The evidence for any miracle necessarily competes with the evidence for the natural laws it supposedly violates. By definition, a miracle claims the most improbable possible event has occurred. This creates what Hume calls a logical contest between opposing evidences. On one side stands the testimony supporting the miraculous claim. On the other stands the uniform experience of humanity supporting the natural law in question. Every human being who has ever lived has experienced fire burning, water flowing downhill, dead bodies remaining dead. This constitutes an enormous weight of counter-evidence against any particular miracle claim. Natural laws carry the authority of universal human experience. They represent not mere theories, but the most reliable patterns we know. When evaluating miracle claims, rational belief faces an inherent problem. The evidence against any miracle is automatically massive, consisting of all the observations that establish the natural law supposedly violated. Hume articulates the principle governing this evidential competition. A wise man proportions his belief to the evidence. Rational belief should adjust itself according to the strength of supporting evidence. But miracle claims face a uniquely challenging evidential burden. They must overcome not just ordinary skepticism but the entire weight of human experience supporting natural regularities. This leads to Hume's famous formulation: no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle, unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish. The testimony supporting a miracle must be so compelling that its falsity would constitute an even greater violation of natural law than the miracle itself. Consider the implications. For miracle belief to be rational, the evidence supporting the miraculous claim must outweigh this massive counter-evidence. The testimony must be so extraordinary that doubting it would require believing something even more improbable than the miracle. This creates an almost impossible evidential standard. Yet, Hume argues it represents the only rational approach to extraordinary claims. This framework extends beyond religious miracles to any extraordinary assertion that conflicts with well-established regularities. The more a claim violates our best understanding of how the world works, the more extraordinary the supporting evidence must be. Hume provides a general method for evaluating paranormal phenomena, conspiracy theories, or any assertion that challenges fundamental natural patterns. The historical origins of miracle claims reveal a telling pattern that undermines their credibility. Hume observes that miracle stories flourish most abundantly amongst ignorant and barbarous nations, or emerge from the distant past when scientific understanding remained primitive. Ancient civilizations, lacking sophisticated methods for investigating extraordinary phenomena, naturally attributed unusual events to supernatural intervention. The correlation proves striking. As societies develop critical thinking and scientific methodology, miracle reports decline dramatically. Modern educated communities, equipped with rigorous investigative techniques, document far fewer miraculous events than their ancient counterparts. This inverse relationship between scientific literacy and miracle belief suggests that such stories thrive precisely where the tools for proper evaluation remain absent. The human psychology underlying miracle testimony introduces systematic distortions that render it fundamentally unreliable. Hume identifies the passion of surprise and wonder as a powerful force that makes people extraordinarily credulous about extraordinary events. We possess an innate appetite for marvelous stories that flatter our sense of living in a universe filled with divine intervention. Religious enthusiasm amplifies this tendency, motivating believers to perceive miraculous confirmations of their faith, even in ambiguous circumstances. Through repeated telling, ordinary events become embellished into supernatural occurrences, whilst witnesses grow more confident in their extraordinary claims rather than less certain over time. These psychological biases operate so consistently that miracle testimony becomes less trustworthy than ordinary historical evidence, not more so. The competing claims of different religious traditions create an insurmountable logical problem for miracle testimony. Christianity proclaims miraculous events that supposedly demonstrate its unique divine authority. Yet Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and countless other faiths make identical claims about their own miraculous foundations. These testimonies prove mutually contradictory, for they cannot all simultaneously establish exclusive religious truth. Consistency demands that if we accept miracle testimony from one tradition based on the quality of its witnesses and documentation, we must accept similar testimony from all others. But this leads to contradictory conclusions about divine truth. The rational response involves rejecting all such claims, rather than arbitrarily privileging one religious tradition over others. Hume's analysis of specific miracle cases demonstrates how extraordinary stories develop and spread through predictable patterns. Contemporary examples like the supposed healings at the tomb of Abbé Paris illustrate these dynamics perfectly. Initial reports of unusual recoveries attracted enormous crowds seeking miraculous cures, creating a social atmosphere ripe for suggestion and embellishment. Under careful investigation, however, the alleged miracles dissolved into natural explanations or unverifiable anecdotes. Witnesses became more confident in their extraordinary claims through social reinforcement rather than additional evidence, whilst the stories themselves grew more miraculous with each retelling. This systematic corruption of testimony reveals why miracle claims consistently fail to meet the evidential standards that extraordinary assertions require for rational acceptance. Hume's critique of miraculous testimony culminates in a positive recommendation that extends far beyond religious belief. The wise person, he argues, proportions belief to evidence and recognizes that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. This principle doesn't categorically disprove miracles, but it demonstrates that believing in them based on available testimony represents epistemic irresponsibility. When testimony conflicts with well-established natural regularities, rational response demands skepticism rather than belief, unless the testimony proves so compelling that its falsehood would constitute a greater miracle than the event it purports to describe. The force of this principle emerges most clearly when we consider the quality of testimony typically offered for miraculous events. Witnesses are often few in number, frequently possess strong religious motivations, and their accounts commonly emerge from cultures predisposed to supernatural explanations. Meanwhile, the events they describe contradict countless observations of natural regularities that form the foundation of human knowledge. The resurrection of the dead conflicts with every medical understanding of biological processes. Water transforming into wine violates fundamental principles of chemistry observed across millennia. Walking on water defies gravitational laws confirmed through endless experience. Hume's approach reveals its broader significance when applied beyond religious miracles to any extraordinary claim conflicting with established knowledge. UFO sightings, psychic phenomena, conspiracy theories, and alternative medicine claims all face identical evidential burdens. They must provide evidence sufficiently strong to outweigh our well-established understanding of how the world operates. Most such claims fail this rigorous test, relying instead on anecdotal testimony, selective evidence presentation, or appeals to dubious authority rather than systematic investigation. The practical wisdom of Hume's principle becomes apparent when navigating our information-rich environment filled with competing claims. Rather than producing paralyzing skepticism, it functions as an effective filter for distinguishing reliable from unreliable information. Claims aligning with well-established knowledge require proportionally less evidence than claims contradicting it. This creates a reasonable middle path between gullible acceptance and cynical rejection of all testimony. Critics might object that Hume's approach proves too restrictive, potentially closing off genuine discoveries. Yet the principle actually promotes, rather than hinders, authentic inquiry by demanding high-quality evidence for extraordinary claims. Scientific revolutions do occur, but they succeed by providing overwhelming evidence, meeting rigorous standards, not by appealing to testimony or authority. When Einstein's relativity contradicted Newtonian physics, it triumphed through mathematical precision and experimental confirmation, not through miraculous testimony. Hume's approach protects against false beliefs whilst remaining genuinely open to discoveries capable of meeting appropriate evidential standards. This critical framework prepares us to examine another realm where extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence. Arguments for divine existence based on the apparent design pervading nature itself. Part 7. The Design, Argument, and Natural Religion. The design argument emerges from a seemingly irresistible observation. The natural world displays the same intricate complexity we find in human creations. When Hume's character Cleanthes presents this reasoning in the dialogues concerning natural religion, he draws our attention to the eye's delicate mechanisms, the precise orbits of planets, and the coordinated systems within living bodies. These natural phenomena, he argues, bear unmistakable resemblance to watches, telescopes, and other ingenious human artifacts. Since we know that complex, purposeful arrangements in human creations result from intelligent design, mustn't similar arrangements in nature also spring from intelligent design? The argument assumes a fundamental principle. Similar effects must have similar causes. Just as the intricate gears of a watch demand a watchmaker, the intricate structures of nature demand a divine designer. Yet Hume, speaking through Philo, exposes the fragility of this analogy. The resemblance between natural objects and human artifacts may be far weaker than design argument proponents assume. Consider how dramatically natural objects differ from human creations in their essential characteristics. A plant grows from internal principles that no human artifact possesses. It reproduces itself, creating new organisms with the same complex organization. It adapts to environmental changes, healing wounds, and adjusting to new conditions. It transforms simple materials from soil and air into elaborate structures through processes we barely understand. No watch repairs itself when broken. No house generates offspring. No machine adapts its design to changing circumstances. These fundamental differences between natural and artificial objects weaken the inference from natural complexity to intelligent design, suggesting that nature operates according to principles entirely unlike human craftsmanship. The logical structure of analogical reasoning itself becomes suspect when extended to such momentous conclusions. Even granting some resemblance between natural objects and human artifacts, the design argument asks us to make an extraordinary leap, from observing familiar, small-scale design to inferring unfamiliar, cosmic-scale creation. We possess extensive experience with human designers and their methods. watching craftsmen shape materials according to plans, observing the relationship between intention and execution in human projects. But we have no comparable experience with universe creators or divine beings. The analogy requires us to assume that slight resemblances between natural and artificial complexity justify enormous conclusions about the ultimate nature of reality. This exceeds what analogical reasoning can legitimately support, transforming a modest similarity into proof of divine existence. Most devastatingly, the design argument's own logic generates implications that contradict the very religious beliefs it was meant to establish. If we follow the analogy consistently, it might suggest multiple designers collaborating on the universe. Since the most complex human projects typically require teams of specialists working together, the apparent flaws and inefficiencies in nature might indicate an imperfect designer, learning through trial and error like human craftsmen. The designer might have died after completing creation, since human designers don't continuously maintain their artifacts once finished. These conclusions, flowing directly from taking the design analogy seriously, undermine rather than support traditional religious doctrine. The argument that promised to prove God's existence leads instead to a picture of cosmic creation that bears little resemblance to the divine being that believers worship. The design argument assumes that natural order requires intelligent planning, but Hume challenges this fundamental premise through devastating alternative explanations. Natural processes themselves generate apparent design without conscious intention. Crystals form intricate, symmetrical patterns through chemical forces alone. Whirlpools create stable, organized structures through fluid dynamics. Snowflakes develop complex geometries through molecular interactions. These examples demonstrate that purely physical principles produce what appears to be deliberate design, yet no designer guides their formation. Through the character Philo in his dialogues, Hume anticipates evolutionary thinking with remarkable prescience. Given sufficient time and matter in motion, even highly complex arrangements could emerge through natural processes that preserve beneficial variations whilst eliminating harmful ones. Organisms well adapted to their environments survive and reproduce, whilst poorly adapted ones perish. Over vast periods, this mechanical process generates the appearance of design without requiring an intelligent designer. The eye's complexity, often cited as evidence of divine craftsmanship, emerges through gradual modifications that enhance survival rather than through conscious planning. This naturalistic approach explains apparent design more economically than supernatural hypotheses. Natural selection operates through observable principles: variation, inheritance, and differential survival. It requires no unknown supernatural agents or mysterious interventions. Moreover, it accounts for both the apparent design we admire and the imperfections, waste, and suffering that seem inconsistent with perfect divine craftsmanship. Vestigial organs, genetic diseases, and mass extinctions make sense within evolutionary processes, but challenge the design argument's assumption of benevolent intelligence. The design argument's deeper flaw lies in treating our single observed universe as obviously requiring explanation. We possess no comparative data about alternative universes to determine whether our cosmos's characteristics are typical or extraordinary. Perhaps universes with natural laws permitting complexity are common. Perhaps only universes capable of supporting observers can be observed by observers, creating an inevitable selection bias. Without knowledge of what other cosmic arrangements are possible, we cannot determine whether our universe's apparent fine-tuning demands special explanation or represents the only type of universe we could possibly observe. The design argument, even if successful, proves far less than its advocates imagine. Suppose we grant that nature's complexity requires an intelligent designer. What exactly have we established? At most, the existence of a powerful architect or architects capable of ordering natural phenomena. But this bare conclusion cannot support the elaborate theological edifice that believers construct upon it. The argument from design cannot establish divine attributes that define traditional religion. Nothing in natural complexity proves the designer's omniscience, omnipotence, or perfect goodness. A finite being of great but limited power could produce the natural order we observe. Multiple designers working in concert might explain nature's mixed character better than a single perfect creator. The inference from effect to cause can only establish properties necessary to produce the observed result, not the infinite attributes that theology demands. Consider what the natural world actually reveals about its supposed designer's character. If we judge the creator from the creation, we encounter a deeply troubling picture. Natural disasters devastate innocent populations. Predators torture their prey. Disease ravages the young and healthy. Death stalks every living thing. The beauty and harmony that inspire design arguments exist alongside suffering and destruction that would condemn any human architect. Hume observes that nature presents nothing but the idea of a blind nature, impregnated by a great vivifying principle and pouring forth from her lap, without discernment or parental care, her maimed and abortive children. This vivid image captures the moral ambiguity that natural theology cannot resolve. If the designer's benevolence must be inferred from natural evidence, that evidence suggests either an imperfect creator, competing forces with opposing aims, or no conscious design at all. The gulf between natural religion and practical faith reveals itself most clearly when we examine what actual religious traditions require. Believers worship their deity, follow moral commandments, and hope for eternal life. But natural theology cannot establish that the cosmic designer desires worship, has revealed moral laws, or promises posthumous rewards. Even perfect proof of a designer's existence leaves these crucial questions unanswered. This gap cannot be bridged through rational argument alone. The move from acknowledging some unknown cause of natural order to embracing specific religious doctrines requires leaps that reason cannot justify. Natural religion, stripped of faith and revelation, offers only the thinnest philosophical deism, acknowledging an abstract first cause whilst remaining silent about human duties and divine purposes. Hume's analysis reveals that practical religion must find its foundation elsewhere than in rational demonstration. The beliefs that actually guide religious life spring from human needs, social traditions, and emotional commitments, rather than philosophical argument. This doesn't disprove religious faith, but it relocates its proper ground from reason to sentiment, from demonstration to human nature itself. This conclusion connects directly with Hume's broader philosophical project. Just as moral judgments arise from sentiment rather than reason, religious beliefs reflect human psychological and social needs rather than rational proof. Both domains reveal the limits of pure reason and point toward a naturalistic understanding of human nature as the foundation for our most important commitments. Part 8. Moral Sentiment and the Foundation of Ethics. Traditional moral philosophy rests on a deceptively simple assumption that discovering moral truth through reason naturally leads to moral action. From Plato's philosopher kings guided by rational insight to medieval scholars seeking divine moral law through theological reasoning, the philosophical tradition has consistently assumed that reason can both identify what we ought to do and motivate us to do it. Hume exposes this assumption as fundamentally mistaken, revealing a logical chasm between rational judgment and motivational force that traditional ethics cannot bridge. The challenge runs deeper than most philosophers realized. When we judge an action as morally wrong, we're not merely making a factual claim about the world. We're expressing disapproval that naturally motivates opposition. This motivational component distinguishes moral judgments from purely descriptive statements. Reason excels at discovering relationships between ideas, like mathematical truths, and matters of fact, like causal connections. But moral approval and disapproval involve something additional that transcends factual description. When we condemn murder as wrong, we're not simply cataloging murder's properties, but expressing an attitude that inherently moves us toward prevention and punishment. This motivational element cannot emerge from reason alone, which remains purely descriptive rather than prescriptive. Reason can map the logical relationships between concepts and trace the causal connections between events, but it cannot generate the emotional force necessary to drive action. The gap between is and ought reflects this deeper psychological reality. Factual knowledge, however complete, cannot by itself create the motivational springs that move human beings to act. Hume crystallizes this insight in his famous declaration that reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions, and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them. This doesn't advocate irrationality but clarifies reason's proper function as instrumental rather than motivational. Reason serves us brilliantly in calculating means to ends, predicting consequences, and revealing logical relationships. But the ends themselves, what we ultimately care about and strive toward, must derive from our emotional nature rather than rational insight. This analysis demolishes centuries of moral philosophy that elevated reason over emotion as the proper guide to ethical behavior. The Stoics sought to align action with rational understanding of cosmic order. Christian philosophers pursued moral truth through rational theology. Enlightenment thinkers like Kant insisted that moral duty must override emotional inclination to possess genuine worth. All assumed that rational insight into moral reality could and should motivate proper conduct, but Hume demonstrates this, misunderstands both reason's nature and morality's psychological foundations. If moral judgments are to influence behavior rather than remain academic exercises, they must connect to the emotional springs of human action. The motivational force that reason cannot supply must come from somewhere else entirely, from the very passions that traditional philosophy sought to subordinate to rational control. Hume's moral philosophy rests on a revolutionary foundation. Our ethical judgments express feelings of approval or disapproval rather than stating objective facts about actions or character traits. When we pronounce an action virtuous or vicious, we're not describing some property the action possesses independently of human responses, but expressing our emotional reaction to it. These moral sentiments arise naturally from human psychology when we contemplate actions and their consequences for human welfare. As Hume formulates it, vice and virtue, therefore, may be compared to sounds, colors, tastes, and smells, which, according to modern philosophy, are not qualities in objects, but perceptions in the mind. This comparison illuminates something profound about moral judgment. Just as colors exist not in objects themselves but in our perceptual responses to them, moral qualities exist not in actions themselves but in our emotional responses to those actions. The redness of a rose emerges from the interaction between light wavelengths and our visual system. Similarly, the wrongness of cruelty emerges from the interaction between certain behaviors and our moral psychology. This doesn't make moral judgments arbitrary or meaningless. Colors remain real and important features of our experience, even though they depend on our perceptual apparatus. Yet moral sentiments differ crucially from mere personal preferences through their disinterested and universal character. When we approve of benevolence or disapprove of cruelty, We're not expressing selfish preferences, but adopting a general human perspective that considers overall welfare rather than personal advantage. We step back from our immediate interests and consider what promotes human flourishing generally. This disinterested standpoint explains why moral judgments feel objective even though they're grounded in sentiment. We abstract from our particular circumstances to take the viewpoint of humanity as a whole. This universality emerges from shared human psychology rather than abstract reasoning. All humans possess the capacity for sympathy, which allows us to share others' pleasures and pains imaginatively. When we witness suffering, we feel echoes of that pain. When we observe happiness, we experience reflected joy. This sympathetic mechanism creates convergent approval for traits and actions that promote human welfare and disapproval for those that cause suffering. We naturally approve of kindness because sympathy makes us feel the pleasure it creates. We disapprove of violence because sympathy makes us feel the pain it inflicts. Cultural differences in moral judgment reflect different circumstances and social arrangements rather than fundamental differences in moral psychology. All societies approve of traits that promote social cooperation and disapprove of those that threaten it, but what counts as cooperative behavior varies with social conditions. Warrior virtues receive approval in societies facing external threats. Commercial virtues gain prominence in trading communities. The underlying sympathetic mechanism remains constant, whilst its applications shift with changing human needs. This sentimental foundation explains morality's motivational force in a way that rational theories cannot. Because moral judgments express our emotional responses, they naturally connect to motivation, and we're moved to promote what we approve and prevent what we disapprove. The same psychological mechanism that generates moral judgment also generates moral motivation. Hume identified what may be the most devastating critique ever leveled against traditional moral philosophy. Reading through the works of his predecessors, he noticed something peculiar. Moral philosophers would begin with purely descriptive statements about human nature, divine commands, or natural law. They would establish facts about how the world is, what God has decreed, or how humans naturally behave. Then, almost imperceptibly, they would shift to making claims about what we ought to do, what moral duties we have, or how we should live. This transition from is to ought appears in virtually every moral system, yet Hume recognized it as logically illegitimate. The problem cuts to the heart of moral reasoning itself. No amount of purely factual description can logically generate normative conclusions without additional moral premises. You might establish that humans are naturally social creatures who depend on cooperation for survival. You might demonstrate that certain actions promote human flourishing whilst others cause suffering. You might even prove that God exists and has issued specific commands. But none of these facts, however well established, can by themselves tell you what you ought to do. The logical gap between descriptive and prescriptive statements cannot be bridged through inference alone. This creates a crisis for traditional approaches to ethics. Religious morality attempts to derive moral duties from facts about divine commands. But why should God's commands create obligations for us? Is less than #0, 5 is greater than natural law theory tries to extract moral principles from facts about human nature and natural purposes. But why should what is natural determine what is right? Utilitarian ethics grounds moral duties in facts about consequences and human happiness. But why should maximizing happiness be our fundamental obligation? Each approach commits what philosophers now call the naturalistic fallacy, deriving normative conclusions from purely descriptive premises. Hume's solution is characteristically radical. Rather than attempting to bridge the is-ought gap, he eliminates the need for such bridging entirely. Moral judgments don't derive from facts about the world, but express our emotional responses to those facts. When we declare murder wrong, we're not stating a fact about murder's objective wrongness, but expressing our disapproval of murder. The judgment reflects our moral sentiments, not our rational analysis of descriptive truths. This sentimental approach avoids the is-ought problem because it abandons the attempt to derive moral conclusions from non-moral premises. Moral sentiments are natural facts about human psychology, but moral judgments don't logically follow from these facts. Instead, they directly express these sentiments. We feel disapproval toward cruelty and express this feeling in moral language. No logical derivation is required because the judgment is the sentiment expressed, not a conclusion inferred from it. Yet this raises profound questions about moral objectivity. If moral judgments merely express subjective sentiments, are they nothing more than personal preferences? Hume argues that moral sentiments, whilst subjective in origin, humans share remarkably similar moral responses because we share similar emotional constitutions and social circumstances. This convergence creates stable moral standards that transcend individual opinion whilst remaining grounded in human nature rather than abstract rational principles. Part 9. Virtue, Character, and Human Excellence. Hume draws a fundamental distinction that cuts through the heart of moral philosophy. Some virtues appear to spring directly from human nature itself, whilst others emerge only through the artificial constructions of society. This division reveals something profound about how morality develops from the intersection of psychological endowment and social experience. Natural virtues like benevolence, courage, and compassion require no social scaffolding to make sense. We feel immediate approval when witnessing genuine kindness, even between strangers who will never meet again. A person rescuing someone from drowning acts from impulses that would be virtuous in any human context, whether in organized society or complete isolation. These virtues flow from our psychological constitution itself. They promote human flourishing directly and generate moral sentiments that seem universal across cultures. The natural quality of these virtues becomes evident when we realize they would retain their value even if all social institutions disappeared tomorrow. Courage would still be admirable, cruelty still deplorable, compassion still moving. They connect immediately to human welfare and psychological satisfaction without requiring conventional agreements about their meaning or value. Artificial virtues present an entirely different picture. Justice, promise-keeping, and respect for property make no sense outside organized society. The obligation to honor promises is meaningless without social practices that create and recognize promissory commitments. What would property rights mean to a solitary individual on a deserted island? Justice involves following rules that exist only because societies have created and maintained them through collective agreement and enforcement. These artificial virtues depend completely on social conventions, yet once established, they become as psychologically compelling as natural ones. Through education, habit, and social reinforcement, people develop genuine emotional attachments to justice and honesty. They feel real approval for fair dealing and authentic disapproval for cheating, even when violations might benefit them personally. This transformation reveals something remarkable about human moral psychology. Artificial virtues become natural through internalization. Social practices shape individual character so thoroughly that conventional obligations feel like natural impulses. The person who recoils from breaking promises has internalized social conventions so completely that artificial virtue generates the same immediate moral sentiments as natural compassion. This analysis illuminates how morality emerges from the dynamic interaction between innate psychological tendencies and social experience. Human moral capacity develops through cultural transmission, creating both universal patterns that reflect shared human nature and cultural variations that reflect different social arrangements. The natural-artificial distinction becomes a tool for understanding how biological endowment and social construction collaborate to produce the complex moral phenomena we actually observe in human societies. Hume reveals something remarkable about human moral psychology. We approve of virtues not because they conform to abstract principles, but because they consistently promote human flourishing. This insight cuts through centuries of philosophical debate about the foundation of ethics by locating it in observable consequences for human welfare. Consider benevolence, the disposition to act kindly toward others. We don't approve of benevolent people because kindness satisfies some cosmic moral law, but because benevolent actions reliably make life better for everyone involved. The benevolent person prevents suffering, creates opportunities for others, and builds the social bonds that make cooperative life possible. Courage operates similarly. We admire brave individuals because courage enables people to face necessary dangers and overcome obstacles to important goals. Without courage, societies cannot defend themselves. Individuals cannot pursue difficult but worthwhile projects, and communities remain vulnerable to threats that could be overcome. Even seemingly minor virtues reveal this utilitarian foundation. Prudence enables wise decision-making that promotes long-term interests over short-term impulses. Wit and social grace contribute to human flourishing by making interactions pleasant and successful, reducing friction in daily social life. Each virtue we genuinely admire serves human welfare in demonstrable ways. Yet Hume's crucial insight concerns how this utility operates through our psychology. We don't approve of benevolence because we consciously calculate its beneficial consequences. Rather, contemplating kind actions naturally produces feelings of approval in observers. This emotional response has been shaped by evolutionary and social experience to track genuine utility. We've developed psychological tendencies to approve of traits that actually promote human flourishing, even when we're not consciously aware of their beneficial effects. This explains both the content and limits of our moral approvals. We approve of honesty because it enables social cooperation, but we make exceptions when honesty would cause more harm than good. We approve of courage in facing genuine dangers but disapprove of reckless risk-taking that serves no useful purpose. Our moral sentiments prove sensitive to context and consequences in ways that reflect their underlying utilitarian foundation. Hume's approach differs fundamentally from later utilitarian theories that make utility a conscious decision-making principle. For Hume, utility explains why we have the moral sentiments we do, but it operates through psychological mechanisms rather than explicit calculation. We don't need to consciously weigh costs and benefits to make sound moral judgments. Our emotional responses, properly cultivated, naturally track utility because they've been shaped by processes that reward genuinely beneficial traits. This creates a sophisticated picture of moral development. Social processes create and maintain moral categories through collective reinforcement of character traits that prove useful for human communities. Moral categories emerge not as eternal truths discovered by reason, but as practical solutions developed by communities facing the fundamental challenge of living together. Hume reveals how what we call virtues and vices begin their existence as loose social tendencies, informal preferences that communities develop naturally for behaviors that promote cooperation, whilst discouraging those that threaten group welfare. These preferences operate initially through the most basic human responses: approval and disapproval, social inclusion and exclusion, the natural tendency to imitate admired individuals, whilst avoiding association with those who attract disapproval. Communities find themselves gravitating toward character traits that facilitate successful cooperation, mutual aid, and collective flourishing. Not because abstract reason demands these preferences, but because experience demonstrates their practical value. This informal process of social selection creates pressure that shapes individual behavior and character development over time. The person who consistently helps others during difficulties finds themselves welcomed, trusted, included in important decisions. The individual who breaks promises or betrays confidences discovers social doors closing, opportunities disappearing, relationships cooling. These consequences operate as a kind of moral education, teaching community members which character traits lead to social success and which lead to isolation. The process works not through punishment and reward in any formal sense, but through the natural human desire for approval, belonging, and social cooperation. What begins as spontaneous preference gradually crystallizes into explicit moral rules through education, cultural transmission, and institutional reinforcement. Communities develop stories that illustrate approved and disapproved behavior, creating memorable examples that transmit moral categories across generations. Parents teach children about courage, honesty, and justice not as abstract concepts, but as character traits that earn respect and enable successful relationships. Religious institutions, legal systems, and cultural traditions provide formal recognition and enforcement of moral standards, transforming informal social preferences into apparently objective moral truths. This transformation creates one of morality's most striking features. Moral categories that originated in social construction come to feel like natural laws. The virtues praised by a community begin to appear as eternal truths about human excellence rather than practical solutions to social challenges. Each generation learns moral categories as established facts about right and wrong, rarely questioning their social origins or recognizing their constructed nature. The process succeeds so completely that moral categories acquire the psychological force of natural phenomena, generating genuine moral emotions and motivating real sacrifice for moral principles. Yet this social construction process explains both moral stability and moral change across different societies and historical periods. Once established, moral categories become self-reinforcing through education and social pressure, creating stable expectations about acceptable behavior that persist across generations. But moral categories also evolve as societies develop new understanding of which character traits actually promote human flourishing. Changes in social organization, technology, or knowledge can reveal that previously approved traits actually harm community welfare, whilst previously ignored traits prove genuinely beneficial. This evolutionary aspect of moral categories creates fascinating possibilities for moral progress and reform. Part 10. Justice and the Origins of Political Society. Hume's analysis of justice begins with a deceptively simple question. Under what conditions does justice become both necessary and possible? His answer reveals justice as neither a natural human instinct nor an arbitrary social convention, but rather a sophisticated response to the specific circumstances that define human social existence. Justice becomes necessary only under conditions of moderate scarcity. If resources were infinitely abundant, there would be no conflicts over possession to resolve. When air is freely available to all, we need no rules governing its distribution. Conversely, if scarcity were extreme, cooperation would become impossible, and only force would matter. In a lifeboat with supplies for 2 but passengers for 10, justice gives way to desperate struggle. Justice emerges in that middle ground where resources are limited enough to create conflicts but sufficient enough to make cooperation worthwhile. The second crucial circumstance involves the limits of human benevolence. If people cared equally for everyone's welfare, property distinctions would be unnecessary. A perfectly benevolent being would share resources naturally, without needing rules to compel generosity. But if people were completely selfish, cooperative agreements would be impossible to maintain. Pure predators cannot form stable societies. Human beings possess what Hume calls limited benevolence. We care deeply for family and friends, moderately for neighbors and fellow citizens, and little for distant strangers. This partial sympathy creates conflicts requiring resolution through artificial rules. The third circumstance proves equally vital: approximate equality of power among individuals. If some people were vastly superior to others in strength, intelligence, or resources, the superior beings could simply take what they wanted without needing to respect others' claims. Justice applies among humans precisely because we are similar enough in capacity that cooperation benefits everyone and coercion remains costly and uncertain. A single person cannot easily dominate many others, and even the strongest individual needs sleep, food, and shelter that others might withhold or destroy. These circumstances explain why justice applies among humans, but not in other relationships. We do not speak of justice between humans and animals because the power differential is too great. We simply use animals for our purposes. We cannot imagine justice between humans and hypothetical gods because divine beings would face no scarcity and need no cooperation from inferior mortals. Justice emerges only among beings sufficiently similar in capacity and circumstance to make mutual respect both necessary and achievable. Understanding these origins reveals justice's artificial character. It represents not a natural human tendency but a social construction responding to practical problems. In conditions where these circumstances change, justice becomes irrelevant or impossible. The rules that govern property and contracts make sense only given moderate scarcity, limited benevolence, and approximate equality. This explains why justice can conflict with other values. Maintaining the cooperative framework sometimes requires ignoring individual needs or preventing beneficial outcomes. Hume identifies the first and most fundamental rule of justice as the stability of possession. This principle establishes that people must be able to rely on continued access to resources they currently control. Without this basic security, no rational person would invest effort in improving land, tools, or materials. Why clear fields or build houses if others might seize them tomorrow? Why develop specialized skills that depend on access to particular instruments if that access remains uncertain? The stability rule doesn't specify how initial possessions are acquired. It might be through first occupancy, conquest, or pure chance, but it prevents the constant redistribution that would make productive activity impossible. Yet stability alone creates a problematic rigidity. If everyone must forever keep exactly what they initially possessed, society remains trapped in arbitrary distributions that serve no one's interests well. This necessity generates the second rule of justice: voluntary transfer by consent. People possess different needs, preferences, and productive capacities. Someone skilled at farming might produce abundant food but lack adequate tools, while someone talented at metalworking might craft excellent implements but struggle to grow sufficient crops. Allowing voluntary exchange enables both parties to benefit through specialization and trade. The farmer trades surplus grain for well-made plows, improving both participants' situations. This rule transforms property systems from mere preservation of arbitrary distributions into mechanisms that can serve human welfare. But even these two rules prove insufficient for complex social cooperation. Simple, immediate exchanges, trading grain for tools on the spot, can operate through the transfer rule alone. Most beneficial cooperation, however, requires commitments about future behavior. Consider lending valuable tools with expectation of return, agreeing to provide services in exchange for payment next harvest, or coordinating group projects requiring sustained effort from multiple participants over months or years. These arrangements demand the third essential rule: performance of promises. Promise-keeping creates temporal stability that enables planning and investment. Without reliable expectations about future behavior, people cannot undertake projects requiring time, cannot lend resources they'll need returned, cannot coordinate complex activities requiring sequential contributions from different parties. These three rules, stability of possession, voluntary transfer, and performance of promises, form the minimal framework within which productive social cooperation becomes possible. Together they create predictable expectations about resource access, enable mutually beneficial exchanges, and allow coordination across time. They don't guarantee optimal outcomes or perfect fairness in every case. Rather, they provide the foundation for productive social life by resolving the fundamental conflicts over scarce resources that would otherwise make cooperation impossible. Yet, as societies grow beyond small groups where everyone knows everyone else, these basic rules of justice require something more for their effective enforcement. Political institutions capable of compelling compliance when individual self-interest conflicts with social cooperation. The intimate circle of a village operates by rules everyone understands without enforcement. When Thomas borrows William's plough and fails to return it, social pressure compels compliance. Thomas faces his neighbors daily. His reputation determines future cooperation. Informal sanctions make dishonesty costly. Justice works through relationships, reputation, and the certainty that violations will be remembered and punished by the community itself. This natural enforcement collapses as society expands beyond personal acquaintance. In Edinburgh's bustling markets, strangers conduct business with people they may never encounter again. The merchant who sells defective goods disappears into anonymity. The debtor who flees to another district escapes social consequences entirely. Victims cannot retaliate effectively against unknown violators, and potential violators calculate that transgression carries little risk of meaningful punishment. The informal mechanisms that maintain justice in small communities prove powerless in large societies where most interactions occur between strangers. Government emerges to solve this enforcement crisis through specialized institutions capable of maintaining justice systematically. Political authority creates courts that can detect violations more reliably than scattered individual monitoring, police forces that can pursue violators more effectively than personal retaliation, and legal systems that coordinate responses to threats requiring collective action is less than #0. 5# is greater than government doesn't invent the rules of justice. Property rights and promise-keeping arise naturally from human needs, but it makes these rules effective in complex societies where informal enforcement fails. Hume's account of political obligation flows from utility rather than consent or natural authority. We owe obedience to government because effective political institutions serve essential human interests by maintaining the framework of justice that enables social cooperation. This obligation doesn't depend on explicit consent, which most citizens never provide, nor on government's perfect legitimacy, which no actual government possesses. Political obligation rests on practical necessity. Without some system of effective authority, large societies would collapse into chaos that serves no one's interests. Yet this utilitarian foundation also defines the limits of political obligation. When government fails catastrophically in its essential function, when political institutions become so corrupt, oppressive, or incompetent that they cause more harm than the disorder they prevent, the practical basis for obedience disappears. Revolution becomes justified not through abstract rights or violated contracts, but through sober assessment of whether existing authority serves or undermines the human interests that justify political power. Hume's sceptical approach refuses both unconditional submission and romantic rebellion, demanding instead careful evaluation of whether particular governments actually fulfill their essential purpose of maintaining the conditions for human flourishing. Part 11. Passion, Reason, and Human Motivation. David Hume delivers a shocking verdict on human nature that overturns millennia of philosophical tradition. Every action you take, every decision you make, every goal you pursue stems ultimately not from rational deliberation, but from passion. Hunger drives you to seek food. Curiosity compels you to ask questions. Fear motivates you to seek safety. Love inspires you to care for others. Reason plays its part, certainly, but always in service to these deeper emotional currents that provide the fundamental springs of human action. This isn't mere psychological observation. It's a revolutionary challenge to the entire Western philosophical tradition that elevated reason as the proper ruler of human life. From Plato's vision of reason controlling the soul's appetites to the Stoic ideal of rational mastery over emotion, philosophers had consistently argued that wisdom meant subordinating passion to rational control. Hume shatters this hierarchy with a simple but devastating insight. Reason alone can never motivate action. It can tell you what is the case and what follows from what, but it cannot tell you what to care about or what to pursue. Consider Hume's most famous formulation: reason is, and ought only to be the slave of the passions, and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them. This provocative language isn't moral prescription but psychological description. Hume reveals the natural order of human psychology rather than advocating for emotional indulgence over rational restraint. When you feel hungry, reason helps you identify where to find food and how to prepare it. When you feel curious about a problem, reason provides the tools for investigation and analysis. When you feel sympathy for someone's suffering, reason suggests effective ways to help them. The scope of this principle extends across every domain of human behavior. The scientist pursuing research feels the passion of curiosity and the satisfaction of discovery. The mathematician solving complex proofs experiences the pleasure of intellectual achievement. The moral reformer fighting injustice burns with indignation at suffering and hope for improvement. Even the philosopher defending the supremacy of reason does so because philosophical activity satisfies deep emotional needs for understanding, recognition, or the pleasure of systematic thinking. This analysis doesn't diminish reason's importance but reveals its proper function. Rational calculation becomes the sophisticated servant of emotional goals, identifying effective means to desired ends and predicting consequences of different courses of action. Without passionate investment in goals and values, rational activity would lack direction and purpose entirely. The question isn't whether to be rational or emotional, but how reason can most effectively serve the passions that make life meaningful and action possible. Hume's analysis of human passion reveals a fundamental distinction that transforms our understanding of motivation and emotion. Direct passions arise immediately from pleasure or pain, operating through simple psychological mechanisms that connect us automatically to our environment. When we experience something pleasant, we desire it. When we encounter pain, we feel aversion. Joy follows naturally from obtaining what we want, whilst sorrow emerges from losing what we value. These responses require no complex reasoning or elaborate mental processing. They represent the mind's most basic emotional machinery, responding directly to immediate experience. These direct passions provide the foundation for all human motivation, yet they cannot explain the rich complexity of emotional life. We feel proud of achievements that occurred years ago, love people who are absent, and experience shame about characteristics we cannot change. Such sophisticated emotions point to a different category entirely: indirect passions that depend on the mind's remarkable capacity to form associations between ideas, experiences, and concepts of self and others. Indirect passions like pride, humility, love, and hatred require cognitive mediation through our ideas of identity and social relationship. Pride arises not from simple pleasure, but from pleasure associated with something we consider ours, our accomplishments, possessions, family, or personal characteristics. The emotion emerges through a complex mental process that connects the pleasant feeling with an idea of self, creating a distinctive emotional response that differs qualitatively from mere joy. Similarly, humility involves pain connected to something we identify with ourselves, whilst love and hatred involve pleasure or pain associated with other persons. These indirect emotions operate through precisely the same associative principles that govern all mental operations: resemblance, contiguity, and causation. We feel pride in our children's achievements because of the causal and resemblance connections between ourselves and our offspring. We experience love for those who benefit us through the causal link between their actions and our pleasure. We feel hatred toward those who harm our friends because of the contiguity between ourselves and those we care about. These associative mechanisms create the entire complex emotional landscape of social existence. Understanding these psychological processes reveals something profound about moral judgment and social behavior. Our approval and disapproval of actions emerge through complex associations between behaviors, consequences, and our ideas of persons and relationships. Moral emotions like guilt, resentment, gratitude, and indignation arise through the same associative machinery that generates pride, love, and hatred. This suggests that moral judgment represents a sophisticated form of emotional response rather than pure rational evaluation. Yet some passions operate so calmly and regularly that we mistake them for the deliverances of reason itself. Hume's analysis of human motivation reveals a crucial distinction that transforms our understanding of apparent rational control over emotion. He divides the passions into two fundamental categories: violent and calm. Violent passions operate with obvious emotional intensity: rage that makes us tremble, terror that paralyzes judgment, overwhelming grief that consumes attention, or sexual desire that dominates consciousness. These clearly feel like emotions and powerfully motivate action through their very turbulence. But calm passions operate entirely differently. They provide steady motivational force whilst lacking emotional turbulence, making them easily mistaken for rational judgment itself. General benevolence toward human welfare feels like a rational principle because it operates consistently across situations without the storm of obvious emotion. Our sense of justice and fair play seems like logical reasoning because it applies universal standards reflectively. Aesthetic appreciation of beauty and harmony appears to be intellectual judgment because it involves careful consideration of proportions and relationships. What Hume calls the general appetite to good. Yet these are actually emotional dispositions that have been refined through experience and social development rather than products of reasoning. They motivate action not through logical compulsion, but through cultivated feeling that has become stable and general rather than violent and particular. This distinction explains the apparent paradox of reason controlling passion. When general benevolence motivates helping a stranger despite personal inconvenience, it looks like rational principle overriding selfish emotion. When sense of justice leads someone to make costly sacrifices for fairness, it appears that moral reasoning has conquered natural selfishness. But Hume reveals this as one type of passion, calm, general, socially cultivated, overcoming another type, violent, particular, immediately self-interested. The implications for practical wisdom become profound. Cultivating calm passions that promote long-term flourishing over immediate gratification becomes the key to wise living. This doesn't require suppressing emotion in favor of reason, but developing emotional dispositions that are stable, reflective, and oriented toward genuine human goods rather than temporary pleasures or narrow advantage. This analysis reconciles Hume's emphasis on passion with the appearance of rational moral judgment. Sophisticated emotional development can look exactly like rational control, whilst actually representing the refinement of our motivational nature through social experience and reflection. Part 12. Taste, Beauty, and Aesthetic Judgment. Beauty exists nowhere but in the mind that contemplates it. This simple yet revolutionary insight forms the cornerstone of Hume's aesthetic philosophy, challenging centuries of philosophical tradition that sought to locate beauty and ugliness as objective properties residing in objects themselves. When you declare a painting beautiful or dismiss a piece of music as ugly, you're not describing features that exist independently of human experience. You're expressing the pleasure or displeasure that arises in your mind when you contemplate these objects under appropriate conditions. This subjectivist approach solves a puzzle that had long troubled aesthetic theorists. Why do aesthetic judgments feel so compelling and objective, whilst generating such persistent disagreement? Hume's answer reveals the sophisticated psychology underlying aesthetic experience. These judgments feel objective because they emerge from disinterested contemplation rather than personal advantage. When you judge something beautiful, you're not expressing mere preference or calculating benefit to yourself. You're responding to features that would produce pleasure in any observer with similar sensibilities, positioned under similar circumstances. Yet genuine aesthetic disagreements persist precisely because observers bring different sensibilities, experiences, and cultural backgrounds to their encounters with objects. The same symphony that moves one listener to tears might leave another cold, not because one response is correct and the other mistaken, but because their different constitutions produce different emotional reactions to identical stimuli. Beauty and ugliness are not discoveries, but responses. Not facts we uncover, but feelings we experience. This analysis parallels Hume's treatment of moral judgment whilst maintaining crucial distinctions. Both aesthetic and moral judgments express emotional responses rather than stating objective facts about the world. Both involve adopting a disinterested perspective that transcends immediate self-interest, considering how objects or actions would affect appropriately situated observers. But aesthetic judgment focuses specifically on the pleasure or displeasure objects produce in contemplation, whilst moral judgment focuses on approval or disapproval of actions and character traits based on their consequences for human welfare. The implications transform our understanding of aesthetic discourse and criticism. If aesthetic judgments are subjective responses rather than objective discoveries, why do we argue about them so passionately? Why attempt to convince others of our aesthetic opinions? Hume suggests that aesthetic discourse serves vital social and educational functions, even without objective aesthetic facts to uncover. We share aesthetic responses to create social bonds, connecting with others through common appreciation. We refine our sensibilities through exposure to different perspectives, discovering new dimensions of objects we might otherwise overlook. We develop more sophisticated appreciation through practice and comparison, training our emotional responses to become more discriminating and sensitive. This raises the profound question of whether some aesthetic judgments are better than others, despite their subjective foundation, pointing towards standards of taste that emerge from human nature itself. Hume faces a striking paradox in his aesthetic theory. If beauty exists nowhere but in the mind that contemplates it, if aesthetic judgment springs from sentiment rather than reason, how can we possibly distinguish good taste from bad? Why should one person's aesthetic response carry more weight than another's? The answer reveals one of Hume's most sophisticated philosophical moves, acknowledging subjectivity whilst establishing objective standards through the nature of qualified observation itself. Some observers possess superior aesthetic judgment, just as some people have keener eyesight or more sensitive hearing. This superiority isn't arbitrary preference, but reflects genuine differences in perceptual capacity and cultivated sensitivity. A qualified aesthetic judge possesses delicate sensibility, the ability to perceive fine distinctions that escape ordinary observation. They detect subtle harmonies, minute flaws, and complex relationships between parts that remain invisible to less refined perception. This delicacy operates like enhanced sensory acuity, revealing aesthetic features that genuinely exist but require particular conditions to be perceived. Extensive experience with the relevant art form provides the second qualification. The judge must have encountered numerous works within a tradition, understanding how artists solve similar problems and achieve different effects. This breadth of exposure creates the comparative framework necessary for accurate judgment, just as a wine expert's palate develops through tasting thousands of wines. Freedom from prejudice and personal interest ensures that judgment responds to the work itself, rather than extraneous factors. Good sense, general intelligence, and sound judgment enables the observer to understand the work's aims and assess how successfully it achieves them. Practice in making comparisons sharpens discriminatory power through repeated exercise of aesthetic faculties. These qualifications aren't arbitrary requirements but reflect the optimal conditions for aesthetic perception to operate. Just as accurate visual perception requires proper lighting, appropriate distance, and healthy eyesight, reliable aesthetic judgment demands the removal of impediments and the cultivation of relevant capacities. The qualified judge doesn't impose external standards, but perceives aesthetic qualities more clearly than those whose perception remains clouded or undeveloped. When critics possessing these qualifications agree in their aesthetic judgments across different periods and cultures, their convergent responses create a reliable standard for distinguishing genuine excellence from temporary fashion or personal whim. The works that maintain their reputation among qualified observers generation after generation, Homer's epics, Shakespeare's plays, Milton's poetry, provide evidence of lasting aesthetic value that transcends cultural boundaries. This convergence doesn't result from conspiracy or tradition, but from the fact that refined sensibility, properly exercised, responds to real aesthetic qualities present in the works themselves. Yet Hume acknowledges the limits of this standard with characteristic philosophical honesty. Perfect agreement among qualified judges remains impossible because differences in age, culture, and individual temperament legitimately influence aesthetic response. The young naturally prefer works expressing passion and energy, whilst mature observers gravitate toward compositions displaying wisdom and restraint. Cultural background shapes the associations and meanings that contribute to aesthetic experience. These variations don't undermine the standard of taste but reveal its proper flexibility. Aesthetic judgment creates profound forms of social connection that transcend mere practical cooperation or conventional agreement. When two strangers discover they both find themselves moved by the same passage of poetry, stirred by the same musical phrase, or captivated by the same landscape, something remarkable occurs. They experience a recognition of shared sensibility that establishes immediate understanding and sympathy. This aesthetic communion operates differently from bonds based on mutual interest, shared background, or common purpose. It reveals a deeper alignment of feeling and perception that suggests fundamental compatibility of nature. These aesthetic communities form around refined appreciation rather than crude utility. People who share sophisticated responses to art, literature, or natural beauty create cultural connections that can bridge differences in social position, practical interests, or personal history. The wealthy patron and the struggling artist, the urban intellectual and the rural observer, might find genuine fellowship in their mutual recognition of excellence in a painting, or their shared delight in a particularly beautiful sunset. Aesthetic judgment thus serves as a democratizing force that creates aristocracies of taste, cutting across conventional social hierarchies. Aesthetic education develops capacities that enhance judgment far beyond artistic appreciation. Learning to perceive subtle distinctions in poetry trains attention to nuance, complexity, and delicate relationship. Someone who can appreciate how a great painter balances color, form, and composition, or how a skilled composer weaves melodic lines into intricate harmonic structures, develops sensitivity to proportion, harmony, and fitness that proves invaluable in other domains. This refined discrimination applies directly to character assessment, where similar attention to subtle cues, complex relationships, and overall coherence determines accurate judgment of human nature. The person educated in aesthetic appreciation brings enhanced perceptual abilities to moral and political questions. They notice inconsistencies others miss, detect false notes in rhetoric, and recognize authentic excellence amid mediocrity. Their training in distinguishing genuine beauty from mere prettiness, profound art from superficial entertainment, sophisticated craft from crude execution, creates standards of discrimination that elevate judgment across all areas of human concern. Great aesthetic experiences expand imaginative understanding and emotional range in ways that directly contribute to moral development. Reading novels allows us to inhabit different perspectives, experience unfamiliar emotions, and encounter complex moral situations from multiple viewpoints. Watching tragic drama confronts us with suffering and nobility we might never witness firsthand. Contemplating paintings presents human faces, gestures, and situations that reveal aspects of character and feeling that broaden our understanding of human possibility. This aesthetic education serves moral education by developing empathy, emotional sophistication, and psychological insight. Someone who has followed the intricate emotional journeys of great literary characters, who has seen how skilled artists capture the subtle interplay of pride, vulnerability, hope, and disappointment in human expression, becomes a more perceptive judge of actual human character and a more sensitive respondent to others' experiences. Hume's aesthetic theory reveals sophisticated psychological capacities that distinguish human nature and enable our cultural achievements. Part 13. Religion, Superstition, and Human Nature. Religious belief presents philosophy with a fascinating puzzle. Rather than asking whether religious beliefs are true or false, David Hume takes a radically different approach in The Natural History of Religion. He asks why humans universally develop religious beliefs and how these beliefs evolve over time. This naturalistic investigation treats religious belief as a psychological phenomenon to be explained through human nature itself, not through theological argument or divine revelation. The origins of religious belief lie in humanity's most basic predicament, facing an uncertain and threatening world that demands both explanation and response. When people encounter events they cannot predict or control, sudden storms that destroy crops, mysterious diseases that kill loved ones, accidents that shatter lives, deaths that arrive without warning, they experience a profound psychological need. They must somehow make sense of these threatening forces whilst finding hope for protection against future dangers. Unable to understand the natural causes of events that affect their welfare, humans naturally attribute them to powerful beings who operate beyond ordinary observation. These invisible agents become the focus of both fear and hope. Fear, because they might cause terrible harm. Hope, because they might provide crucial protection. This psychological tendency appears across all cultures and historical periods, suggesting it reflects fundamental human nature rather than cultural accident or divine inspiration. From these basic origins, religious hypotheses follow predictable psychological patterns as they develop and elaborate. Polytheism emerges first because the mind attributes different threatening events to different supernatural agents. Storm gods control weather, fertility goddesses govern harvests, war deities determine battle outcomes, household spirits affect domestic life. This multiplication of divine beings reflects the mind's natural tendency to create specific explanations for specific phenomena, rather than seeking unified theories. As societies become more politically centralized and intellectually sophisticated, religious beliefs undergo a crucial transformation. The mind begins seeking unity among the various supernatural agents, leading to hierarchical pantheons and eventually to monotheism. But Hume argues this evolution represents psychological consolidation rather than rational progress toward truth. The same mental tendencies that created polytheism, the desire for simple, powerful explanations of threatening events, drive the development towards single supreme deities. Different psychological types naturally generate different forms of religious expression, each reflecting the underlying human need to explain and control an uncertain world. Hume draws a crucial psychological distinction that cuts to the heart of religious experience. Superstition and enthusiasm represent two fundamentally different ways human nature responds to the divine. Superstition emerges from fear and uncertainty about unknown supernatural powers, driving believers to seek security through elaborate rituals, priestly mediation, and institutional authority. The superstitious mind craves certainty about divine favor and protection, finding comfort in prescribed ceremonies, traditional observances, and the guidance of religious hierarchies. Enthusiasm takes the opposite path, claiming direct personal experience of the divine that makes external religious authorities unnecessary or even harmful. Enthusiasts believe they receive immediate divine inspiration, rendering priests, institutions, and traditional practices obsolete obstacles to authentic spiritual experience. These psychological differences create profoundly different social consequences. Superstition promotes what Hume calls social and political tyranny by cultivating habits of submission and dependence. Superstitious believers defer to priests and religious institutions to interpret divine will, perform necessary rituals, and mediate between human and divine realms. This creates powerful religious hierarchies that naturally ally with political authorities, since both benefit from populations trained in obedience and conformity. The elaborate ceremonies and strict observances of superstitious religion extend beyond religious contexts, creating citizens comfortable with authority, hierarchy, and traditional social arrangements. Superstition thus supports existing power structures whilst discouraging independent thought and social change. Enthusiasm generates the opposite danger, anarchy, and social disruption through rejection of established authorities. Enthusiasts claim divine guidance that supersedes human laws, social conventions, and institutional authorities. This psychological confidence that liberates them from superstitious submission can make them dangerous to social order. When individuals believe they receive direct divine commands, they may embrace antinomianism, rejecting moral law as unnecessary for the divinely inspired. Political rebellion becomes religiously justified resistance to merely human authorities. Social fragmentation follows as different enthusiasts claim contradictory divine inspirations, each convinced of their unique access to divine truth. Neither superstition nor enthusiasm is inherently good or evil, but each creates characteristic benefits and dangers that societies must navigate. Superstition tends to support social stability and existing hierarchies, whilst potentially enabling political oppression and intellectual stagnation. Enthusiasm promotes individual liberty and challenges corrupt authorities, whilst risking social chaos and moral relativism. Understanding these psychological types provides tools for predicting how religious movements will interact with political and social institutions, revealing religion's deeply ambiguous role in human affairs. Religious belief presents a fundamental paradox in human society. Hume recognized that religion simultaneously serves as one of our most powerful sources of moral motivation and one of our greatest threats to social peace. This duality emerges from the very psychological mechanisms that make religious belief so compelling and socially significant. Religion strengthens moral behavior by adding supernatural sanctions to social norms. When people believe an all-seeing deity observes their actions and will ultimately reward virtue whilst punishing vice, they possess additional motivation for ethical conduct beyond immediate social consequences. The shopkeeper who returns excess change, the witness who tells the truth under oath, the neighbor who helps during crisis. These moral actions often occur when human authorities cannot detect violations and social pressure proves insufficient. Religious belief creates an internal moral supervisor that operates even in solitude, reinforcing honesty, compassion, and justice through divine accountability. Yet this same psychological power generates extraordinary social dangers when religious conviction becomes fanatical. People who believe they possess absolute divine truth feel justified in suppressing competing viewpoints and persecuting those who disagree. The Crusades, the Inquisition, sectarian warfare. These historical catastrophes demonstrate how religious belief can override normal moral restraints and generate cruelty that purely secular disagreements rarely produce. The psychological mechanisms that make religion morally motivating become socially destructive when directed toward eliminating religious competitors. Hume advocated moderate skepticism as the healthiest approach to religion. Rather than dogmatic atheism or uncritical belief, intellectual humility about religious claims allows people to appreciate religion's cultural contributions whilst avoiding fanaticism's dangers. Religious traditions enrich art, literature, moral education, and social cohesion without requiring literal acceptance of supernatural doctrines. This approach preserves religion's beneficial social functions whilst minimizing its potential for generating conflict. Civil society requires religious toleration that prevents any single religious view from dominating political life, whilst allowing different traditions to contribute to cultural diversity and moral discourse. Religious toleration serves not merely individual freedom, but social peace by preventing the conflicts that arise when political power enforces particular religious beliefs. This creates space for religion's constructive social role whilst containing its destructive potential. These insights about religion's ambiguous social role exemplify Hume's broader vision of human nature as fundamentally driven by sentiment rather than reason, capable of both moral excellence and dangerous excess, depending on how our passions are directed and channeled. Part 14. The Science of Human Nature. David Hume proposed something revolutionary for 18th century philosophy. The human mind should be studied like any other natural phenomenon. Just as Newton had revealed the mathematical structure underlying physical motion through careful observation and systematic investigation, Hume argued that philosophy could discover the psychological principles governing human thought and behavior through empirical study of mental phenomena. This represented a fundamental departure from traditional philosophy's reliance on abstract reasoning about what the mind ought to be like, toward a scientific approach grounded in observation of how the mind actually operates. The implications were staggering. If human psychology followed discoverable natural laws, then the study of human nature could achieve the same certainty and practical utility as physics or chemistry. Understanding the principles of association, belief formation, and motivation might improve education, politics, and social organization just as understanding physical principles had revolutionized technology and medicine. Philosophy could finally escape the endless disputes that had plagued it for centuries by adopting the experimental method that had proven so successful in natural philosophy. Hume immediately put this approach into practice throughout his philosophical investigations. Rather than beginning with abstract principles about what knowledge or morality should be, he observed how beliefs actually form, how moral judgments actually arise, how emotions actually motivate action. He treated introspection, behavioral observation, and cross-cultural comparison as sources of data about human psychology, then formulated hypotheses about underlying principles that could explain these observations. When he examined causation, for instance, he didn't ask what logical connection must exist between cause and effect, but rather what psychological processes lead us to form causal beliefs. This methodology yielded remarkable innovations. Hume developed the copy principle to trace complex ideas back to their simple impressions, revealing how apparently abstract concepts derive from concrete experience. He analyzed seemingly rational processes like causal reasoning into their psychological components, showing how habit and custom shape what we take to be logical necessity. He explained cultural variations in belief and practice through universal psychological principles, operating under different circumstances, anticipating modern approaches in cognitive science and anthropology, whilst maintaining philosophical sophistication about fundamental questions. Yet this scientific approach to human nature revealed something deeply unsettling. The very methods that promised to establish philosophy on firm foundations also exposed the limits of human understanding itself. Hume's investigations into human nature reveal a profound paradox at the heart of our cognitive existence. The human mind emerges as both remarkably sophisticated and fundamentally limited. We possess extraordinary capacities for complex reasoning, moral judgment, aesthetic appreciation, and social cooperation. Yet these same investigations demonstrate that our most basic beliefs about causation, external objects, personal identity, and moral truth cannot be rationally justified. They arise not from logical demonstration but from psychological necessity. This discovery transforms our understanding of knowledge itself. When we examine how beliefs actually form in human minds, we find that even our most confident convictions rest on psychological foundations rather than rational proof. The belief that the sun will rise tomorrow, that physical objects exist independently of our perceptions, that we possess continuing personal identity. These fundamental assumptions that structure our entire experience cannot be established through reason alone. They emerge from the natural operations of imagination, habit, and association. Recognizing these cognitive limits promotes intellectual humility whilst protecting against dogmatism in philosophy, religion, and politics. When we understand that our most cherished beliefs arise from psychological mechanisms rather than logical necessity, we become more tolerant of disagreement and more open to revising opinions based on new experience. This doesn't produce paralyzing skepticism, but rather a more flexible and empirical approach to knowledge that emphasizes practical success over absolute certainty. Understanding our cognitive limitations can actually improve human judgment by revealing the sources of systematic errors and biases. When we comprehend how association, habit, and emotion shape belief formation, we can design procedures to counteract their distorting effects, where accuracy matters most. Scientific method compensates for our tendency to see patterns where none exist. Legal procedures guard against the influence of irrelevant associations. Democratic institutions channel our natural tendency toward faction and prejudice into productive competition between ideas. Hume's moderate skepticism becomes a virtue that prevents overconfidence whilst allowing practical engagement with the world. His approach avoids both dogmatic confidence in reason's power to achieve absolute knowledge and cynical doubt about all human beliefs. Instead, it promotes sophisticated understanding that our beliefs are natural responses to experience that generally serve us well, even though they cannot be philosophically justified. This creates intellectual humility without practical paralysis. We can act decisively on beliefs we cannot prove, confident that they emerge from reliable psychological mechanisms shaped by millions of years of evolution and individual experience. The science of human nature thus provides the foundation for all other intellectual enterprises, showing how creatures with limited rational capacities can nonetheless navigate the world successfully through the sophisticated operations of sentiment, imagination, and habit. David Hume's most radical insight transforms our understanding of knowledge itself. Every claim we make about the world, whether in mathematics, physics, history, or morality, ultimately depends on human minds, observing, reasoning, and judging. The mathematician perceives relationships between numbers through mental operations. The physicist infers causal connections through patterns of experience. The historian evaluates testimony through memory and belief. The moral philosopher judges actions through sentiment and sympathy. Strip away the human element, and these sciences vanish entirely. This recognition reveals something profound about the architecture of knowledge. We cannot understand what any particular science achieves without first understanding the psychological capacities that make it possible. The science of human nature becomes the master science, the foundation upon which all other intellectual enterprises rest. When we grasp how the mind actually works, its powers, its limitations, its systematic tendencies, we gain the key to evaluating every form of human knowledge. Hume demonstrates this through his analysis of causation. Natural science depends entirely on causal reasoning. Yet, when we examine this reasoning closely, we discover it operates through habit and custom rather than logical demonstration. The mind observes constant conjunctions. This psychological mechanism enables scientific prediction and explanation, but it also reveals the limits of scientific certainty. Understanding the mental basis of causal reasoning simultaneously explains both the remarkable success of natural science and why that success cannot provide absolute certainty about the nature of reality. The same principle applies across all domains of knowledge. Mathematical reasoning succeeds because human minds can perceive necessary relationships between ideas, that the angles of a triangle must equal two right angles, that contradictions cannot be true. Historical knowledge succeeds because human minds can evaluate testimony, compare sources, and construct probable narratives from evidence. Moral judgment succeeds because human beings possess sympathetic capacities that allow them to respond to the pleasures and pains of others. Each science works because it employs psychological capacities suited to its particular domain. This unified framework reveals how apparently disparate intellectual activities share common foundations whilst operating in different spheres. The historian and the natural philosopher both rely on inductive reasoning, but one applies it to human testimony, whilst the other applies it to natural regularities. The mathematician and the moral philosopher both make judgments about relationships, but one concerns abstract ideas, whilst the other concerns sentiments and their objects. Understanding these underlying psychological processes illuminates both the connections and the differences between various forms of knowledge. Most importantly, this approach provides practical guidance for improving human understanding. When we recognize that causal reasoning operates through habit rather than demonstration, we can develop more realistic expectations about scientific knowledge, appreciating its remarkable power, whilst avoiding dogmatic claims about absolute truth. When we understand that moral judgment expresses refined sentiment rather than abstract reasoning, we can focus on cultivating proper feelings rather than pursuing impossible rational proofs of ethical principles. Part 15. Conclusion. David Hume emerges not as a destroyer of human knowledge, but as its most honest cartographer, mapping both the territories we can confidently explore and the vast regions that lie forever beyond our reach. His complete philosophical vision forms a unified system where skeptical arguments about causation, induction, and personal identity serve not to paralyze human thought, but to liberate it from impossible demands for absolute certainty. The great skeptic reveals himself as the great naturalist, showing us how human life proceeds successfully through natural belief, custom, and sentiment, rather than through rational demonstration. Hume's fundamental insight transforms our understanding of reason's proper role in human existence. Rather than the sovereign faculty that traditional philosophy imagined, reason emerges as a sophisticated servant to emotion and practical necessity. We navigate the world not through logical proof but through psychological mechanisms refined by evolution and social development. Our beliefs about causation arise from habit, our moral judgments from sentiment, our sense of personal identity from the natural flow of associated ideas. These mechanisms cannot be rationally justified, yet they enable remarkable human achievements in science, morality, and social cooperation. The tension between philosophical doubt and natural confidence becomes productive rather than destructive. We can acknowledge that our most basic beliefs about the external world, causal necessity, and moral obligation lack rational foundation, whilst continuing to live with practical assurance. This intellectual humility, paired with natural confidence, creates a mature philosophical position that avoids both dogmatic overconfidence and paralyzing skepticism. Hume shows us how to think clearly about the limits of human understanding, without abandoning the natural beliefs that make human life possible and meaningful. His empirical approach to human nature anticipates modern developments in psychology and cognitive science, whilst maintaining philosophical depth about ultimate questions. Understanding how humans actually think, feel, and act provides more reliable guidance than abstract speculation about how reason dictates we should behave. Moral philosophy grounds itself in human sentiment rather than divine command or rational principle. Political theory emerges from observed patterns of human cooperation rather than social contract fantasies. Even aesthetic judgment reveals systematic patterns in human response rather than arbitrary personal preference. The great skeptic's lasting legacy lies in showing that accepting the limits of human knowledge enhances rather than diminishes human dignity. Our remarkable capacities for complex emotional response, moral sentiment, and social cooperation become more impressive when we recognize they cannot be reduced to simple rational calculation. Human life achieves meaning and success not despite our cognitive limitations, but through psychological mechanisms that enable us to flourish within those constraints. Hume's philosophy offers intellectual sophistication without practical paralysis, philosophical depth without existential despair, a vision of human nature that is both humble about our ultimate knowledge and confident in our natural capacities to live well together in an uncertain world.